Gun Trouble. Chapter 1. The sun blazed like a merciless eye in the copper sky above the Arizona Territory, its rays hammering down upon the endless expanse of desert that stretched away in all directions from the narrow trail. Heat waves danced and shimmered above the red earth, creating phantom lakes that vanished like broken dreams as soon as a man fixed his gaze upon them. The air itself seemed to burn, carrying with it the sharp scent of sage and the dusty promise of a land that gave up its secrets grudgingly, if at all. Rip Campbell pulled his sweat-stained Stetson lower over his eyes and shifted his lanky frame in the saddle, the leather creaking beneath him like old bones. 6 feet 4 inches of raw-boned cowboy, he rode his big bay gelding with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, yet there was something in his bearing that spoke of weariness deeper than mere physical fatigue. His angular face, all sharp cheekbones and jutting jaw, beneath a thatch of sun-bleached yellow hair, wore the expression of a man riding toward trouble he couldn't quite name but felt in his very bones. 300 miles of hard trail lay behind him, stretching back across New Mexico territory to the ranch where he and Roy Stover had hired on for spring roundup. 300 miles of alkali dust and scorching sun, of nights spent rolled in his blankets beneath stars that seemed close enough to pluck from the velvet sky, yet remained as distant and cold as his chances of finding his missing partner alive. The trail had been cold from the start, colder than a snake's belly in January. Roy had simply vanished one morning like smoke on the wind, leaving behind only his bedroll and a letter addressed to Rip in that familiar scrawling hand. The letter had been brief, written in Roy's typical fashion with more questions than answers. Partner, following a lead on something big. Arizona Territory, near San Carlos. If I'm not back in a month, come looking. Something doesn't smell right about this deal, but the money's too good to pass up. Watch your back. Roy. That had been 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks of worry, gnawing at Rip's gut like a persistent coyote, growing stronger with each passing day of silence. Roy Stover might be short in stature and red-headed as a phoenix, but he was steady as bedrock and twice as dependable. If Roy said he'd be back in a month, he'd be back, unless something had happened to prevent it. The bay gelding snorted and tossed his head, bringing Rip back to the present moment. Ahead, the trail began its descent into a maze of twisting canyons and broken mesas that marked the approach to San Carlos. The town lay somewhere in that jumbled landscape of red rock and purple shadow, a rough mining settlement that had sprung up around silver strikes and cattle ranges carved from land that fought back against every attempt to tame it. Rip had heard stories about San Carlos during his journey, stories told in hushed voices around campfires and in the back rooms of saloons. It was a town where men minded their own business and asked few questions, where a fast gun counted for more than a clean conscience, and where the law wore whatever face had the most power behind it. The kind of place that attracted drifters and desperados, honest cowboys and crooked cattle buyers, all rubbing shoulders in an uneasy dance of commerce and survival. As his horse picked its way down the rocky slope, Rip's hand dropped instinctively to the Colt .45 that rode low on his left hip. The gun felt solid and reassuring beneath his palm, its worn grip shaped by years of practice and the occasional necessity of frontier justice. He was no gunfighter, had never sought out trouble for its own sake, but the West had a way of testing every man's resolve, and Rip had learned early that sometimes a gun was the only argument that carried weight in a dispute. The canyon walls began to close in around him, their red sandstone faces carved into fantastic shapes by wind and water over countless centuries. Ancient pictographs decorated some of the rock faces, mysterious symbols left by people who had walked these trails long before the first white man had ever dreamed of crossing the Great Divide. They seemed to watch him pass with the eternal patience of stone, keeping their secrets as they had for generations uncounted. A hawk circled high overhead, riding the thermals with lazy grace as it searched the canyon floor for unwary prey. Its cry echoed off the rocks, a wild sound that seemed to speak of freedom and danger in equal measure. Rip watched it for a moment, envying the bird's ability to see the land spread out below like a map, revealing all the hidden places where a man might choose to make his stand or meet his end. The trail twisted deeper into the canyon country, and with each turn, Rip felt the weight of impending confrontation settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. Whatever had happened to Roy Stover, whatever trouble his partner had stumbled into, the answers lay somewhere ahead in this labyrinth of stone and shadow. And Rip Campbell had ridden too far and come too close to turn back now, regardless of what he might find waiting in the red dust of San Carlos. The sun continued its relentless journey across the brassy sky, and the desert stretched endlessly away in all directions, beautiful and terrible in its vast indifference to the hopes and fears of the solitary rider who pushed deeper into its heart, following a trail that might lead to Reunion or to a grave marked only by wind-carved stone and the eternal silence of the wilderness. Chapter 2. "Easy, Buck, easy now," Rip murmured to his bay gelding as the horse's ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring at some scent carried on the afternoon breeze. The animal's muscles tensed beneath the saddle, and Rip felt that familiar tightening in his own chest that came when danger rode the wind. The crack of a rifle split the desert silence like a lightning bolt, the sound bouncing off canyon walls in a series of diminishing echoes that seemed to roll on forever. Buck shied sideways, nearly unseating his rider, while somewhere in the maze of red rock ahead, another shot answered the first, followed by a rapid staccato of gunfire that spoke of desperate men fighting for their lives. Rip pulled his mount to a halt behind a screen of juniper and pinon pine that clung precariously to the canyon's edge. His keen blue eyes swept the broken terrain below, searching for the source of the battle that had erupted in what moments before had been the cathedral silence of the high desert. The gunfire came in waves now, the sharp bark of rifles punctuated by the deeper roar of heavy revolvers, and beneath it all, he could hear the faint sound of men's voices raised in anger and desperation. Swinging down from the saddle, Rip ground-tied Buck in the shade of the twisted trees and moved forward on foot, his long frame bent low to avoid skylining himself against the rim. The rocky ground beneath his boots was treacherous with loose shale and hidden crevices, but he had learned long ago to move like a ghost across such terrain, placing each step with the careful precision of a man who understood that a single misplaced boot could mean the difference between life and death. The canyon opened before him like a great wound in the earth, its walls painted in shades of rust and gold by countless seasons of wind and weather. Ancient layers of sediment told the story of vanished seas and forgotten epics, but Rip's attention was fixed on more immediate concerns. Far below, at the bottom of the twisting gorge, he could see the flash of muzzle fire among the scattered boulders and brush that dotted the canyon floor. A movement caught his eye, and he pressed himself flat against the sun-warmed stone, peering through a gap in the rimrock vegetation. There, a lone figure crouched behind an outcropping of red sandstone, Winchester rifle glinting in his hands as he sought targets among the rocks across the canyon. Even at this distance, Rip could see the man was older, gray-haired and stocky, dressed in the practical clothing of a working rancher. His hat lay beside him, pierced by what looked like bullet holes, and dark stains on his shirt suggested he had already paid a price for this fight. The besieged man's rifle spoke again, and somewhere in the jumbled maze of stone and scrub oak, someone cursed with the creative vocabulary of a mule skinner. But the odds were clearly against the lone defender. Rip counted at least 4 separate positions from which return fire was coming, the smoke rising like incense in the still air to mark each shooter's location. A massive boulder, balanced on the canyon's edge, caught Rip's attention. The stone looked as though it had been placed there by the hand of some ancient giant, poised so precariously that a strong man might be able to set it rolling with the right leverage. It reminded him of stories the old-timers told about Indian warriors who had used such natural weapons against their enemies, sending tons of rock crashing down into the canyons below to devastating effect. The rifle fire intensified, and Rip saw the gray-haired man stagger, his left arm going limp as crimson spread across his sleeve. The defender's weapon wavered, and for a moment it seemed he might fall. But with grim determination, the wounded man propped his rifle against the rock and continued to return fire, though his shots were becoming increasingly erratic. "Got him, boys," a voice drifted up from the canyon floor, thick with cruel satisfaction. "That old buzzard's wing is busted good now. He can't hold out much longer." "Don't get careless, Carp," another voice replied, this one carrying the authority of command. "Simpson's tougher than Rawhide, and twice as mean when he's cornered. Keep your heads down and make your shots count." Simpson. The name meant nothing to Rip, but something in the tone of the voices below set his teeth on edge. There was a quality to the laughter that followed, a sound devoid of honor or mercy, that spoke of men who took pleasure in another's pain. Whatever fight was being waged in this remote canyon, it had the stench of murder about it. The wounded man, Simpson, struggled to reload his rifle with one good arm, fumbling with the cartridges as more shots rang out from his attackers. One of the bullets struck the rock beside his head, showering him with splinters of stone. He ducked lower, but Rip could see the man's strength was failing. Dark patches were spreading on the ground beneath him, and his movements were becoming sluggish with blood loss. A flash of metal caught the afternoon sunlight, and Rip's eyes narrowed as he spotted one of the attackers moving between the boulders. The man wore a vest over his shirt, and pinned to that vest was something that made Rip's blood run cold, the unmistakable glint of a lawman's badge. A sheriff's star, bright as a new dollar, riding the chest of a man who was systematically hunting down what appeared to be an honest rancher. The implications hit Rip like a physical blow. If the law itself was corrupt in this country, if badges meant nothing more than licenses for murder, then what hope did an honest man have? More importantly, what had Roy Stover stumbled into when he'd followed his mysterious lead to this godforsaken corner of Arizona territory? Another shot echoed through the canyon, and Simpson's rifle fell silent. The old rancher slumped against his rocky fortress, his face pale as bleached bone beneath the desert sun. The attackers' voices rose in triumph, and Rip could see them beginning to emerge from cover, confident that their prey was finally finished. But as the man with the badge stepped into clear view, rifle raised for what would surely be a killing shot, something inside Rip Campbell snapped like a taut rope under too much strain. His hand dropped to the Colt at his side, the weapon clearing leather with the fluid grace of long practice. Chapter 3. "Hold it right there, Simpson." Rip's voice rang out across the canyon, carrying the iron authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The Colt in his hand tracked smoothly as he sighted down the barrel at the wounded rancher below. "Drop that rifle and step away from them rocks." The effect of his words was immediate and dramatic. The four attackers froze in their positions, heads swiveling upward, as they searched the rimrock for the source of this unexpected intervention. Simpson himself jerked as though stung by a sidewinder, his good hand tightening reflexively on his Winchester before reason overcame instinct and he allowed the weapon to slide from his grasp. "Who the devil?" began the man with the sheriff's badge, his voice carrying up from the canyon floor like the growl of a disturbed bear. "Name's Campbell," Rip called back, keeping his revolver trained on Simpson while his eyes swept the positions of the other men. "Rip Campbell, and I'd advise you boys to keep them hands where I can see 'em. This here's a long-range Colt, and I've got the high ground." The sheriff, a massive man whose bulk strained the seams of his vest, stepped into fuller view, his own weapon lowered but not holstered. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," he said, squinting up at the distant figure on the rim. "Mighty glad to see you, stranger. This old sidewinder's been giving us a powerful lot of trouble." From his vantage point high above the canyon floor, Rip could see the lawman's companions emerging more boldly from their concealment. One was a tall, lean scarecrow of a man with the cold eyes of a professional killer. Another was built like a whiskey barrel, short and thick through the middle, with hands that seemed too large for his stubby arms. The fourth remained partially hidden behind a cluster of boulders, but Rip caught glimpses of movement that suggested nervous energy barely held in check. Simpson raised his grizzled head, and even at this distance, Rip could see the confusion and desperation written across the old rancher's weathered features. Blood continued to seep from the wound in his arm, staining the red earth beneath him a darker shade of crimson. His lips moved as though he were trying to speak, but no sound carried up to where Rip crouched among the rimrock junipers. "What's this man done?" Rip called down to the sheriff, though something in his gut was beginning to whisper warnings that all was not as it appeared. The scene below had the look of a planned execution rather than a lawful arrest, and the way the other men positioned themselves spoke of experience in such matters. "Rustling," the fat lawman replied without hesitation. "Caught him red-handed, driving a herd of stolen cattle toward the Mexican border. Been tracking this old coot for nigh on 2 days now." He gestured with his rifle toward Simpson. "Name's Duffy, Sheriff Tom Duffy. These here are my deputies, helping me bring in a dangerous criminal." The words should have satisfied Rip's concerns, but instead they seemed to deepen the knot forming in his stomach. Something about the sheriff's tone, the way his so-called deputies held their weapons, the very choreography of the confrontation below, it all felt wrong, like a stage play performed by actors who had forgotten their lines. Simpson was struggling to sit upright, using his good arm to prop himself against the boulder that had served as his fortress. His lips were moving again, and this time Rip thought he caught fragments of words carried on the desert wind, though he couldn't make out their meaning. The old rancher's eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to burn across the intervening distance. "Mr. Campbell," Sheriff Duffy continued, his voice taking on a more commanding tone, "I'd be obliged if you'd come on down here and help us secure this prisoner. Man of your obvious capabilities would be a welcome addition to any posse." The flattery struck Rip as false as a $3 bill, and he found himself studying the scene below with increasing suspicion. If Simpson was truly a rustler caught in the act, where were the stolen cattle? Why was the man wounded and apparently fighting for his life rather than surrendering to properly constituted authority? And why did those deputies look more like hired guns than sworn officers of the law? A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its piercing cry seeming to mock the tension that crackled through the still air like electricity before a thunderstorm. The bird's shadow passed across the canyon floor, and for a moment it seemed to Rip like an omen, though whether of good fortune or ill he could not say. "Simpson," he called down, making his decision. "You got anything to say before I come down there to help arrest you?" The grizzled rancher's head snapped up at the question, and now his voice carried clearly across the intervening space, though it was weak with pain and loss of blood. "Stranger, don't know you, but if you're an honest man, don't trust that badge." "Shut your lying mouth, you old buzzard," snarled the barrel-chested deputy, taking a threatening step toward Simpson. "Sheriff, let me put this sidewinder out of his misery before he can spread any more of his poison." "Hold on there, Carp," Duffy said quickly, though his eyes never left Rip's position on the rim. "Mr. Campbell here is going to help us take this criminal back to San Carlos for a proper trial. Ain't that right, friend?" But Simpson was speaking again, his voice gaining strength from some hidden reserve of determination. "Roy Stover," he gasped, the words hitting Rip like physical blows. "You come, looking for Roy Stover?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and Rip felt his carefully constructed assumptions crumbling like an adobe wall in a flash flood. How could this wounded stranger possibly know about Roy? What connection could there be between his missing partner and this deadly confrontation in a remote Arizona canyon. "How do you know Roy Stover?" Rip demanded, his voice sharp as a whip crack. Simpson's answer came in a hoarse whisper that barely carried to Rip's ears. "Because they're going to hang him. Tonight." The sheriff's curse exploded across the canyon like a thunderclap, and suddenly the fat lawman's rifle was swinging upward, seeking a target among the rim rock where Rip crouched. In that instant of revelation and betrayal, everything became crystal clear. The badge meant nothing, the law was a mockery, and Roy Stover was in mortal danger. Rip's Colt roared, flame and smoke erupting from its barrel, as he shifted his aim from Simpson to the corrupt sheriff below. Chapter 4. He's a ranger, blast your hides. A Texas Ranger. The words, raw and laced with pain, ripped through the echoing din of gunfire that had turned the canyon into a slaughter pen. Jim Simpson, his face a mask of bloody dust and agonizing effort, pushed himself fractionally higher against the rough stone that was both his shield and his prison. His voice, surprisingly potent for a man leaking life onto the parched earth, clawed its way above the roar of Rip Campbell's avenging Colt and the answering snarl of the posse's weapons. A sudden, ringing silence descended, so profound it seemed the desert itself held its breath. Smoke, acrid and biting, drifted in lazy plumes across the canyon floor, momentarily obscuring the figures below. Rip, crouched behind a weathered slab of granite on the rim, felt the unexpected declaration strike him with the force of a physical blow. His own Colt, still hot and bucking from the recent dispatch of the squat gunman who'd murdered Simpson in cold blood, lowered a fraction. His eyes, chips of glacial ice, remained fixed on the men below, trying to pierce the settling haze. Sheriff Tom Duffy, his massive frame momentarily frozen mid-stride, swiveled his head towards Simpson. Even from the rim, Rip could see the incredulity warring with a new, unwelcome flicker of apprehension in the lawman's porcine eyes. The tall, lean deputy beside him, a man whose face seemed hewn from sun-dried leather and malice, also paused, his rifle halfway to his shoulder. The third man, a jumpy, ferret-faced individual Rip had barely glimpsed, went utterly still near the mouth of a shallow wash. "A ranger?" Duffy's voice, when it came, was a hoarse rasp, stripped of its earlier bluster. "Simpson, you're delirious with blood loss. There ain't no ranger called to this." Rip remained silent, his mind racing. He knew the reputation of the Texas Rangers. Men who rode where they willed, answered to few, and often brought a harsh, unyielding justice to the lawless corners of the frontier. They were a specter that haunted men like Duffy, a potential reckoning that could unravel carefully constructed webs of corruption with ruthless efficiency. Simpson's desperate ploy was a wild gamble, a flimsy shield thrown up in a hurricane, yet the very air in the canyon seemed to thicken with its audacious possibility. "Delirious, am I?" Simpson coughed, a raw, wet sound. "Look at him, Duffy. Look at the way he fights." Came out of nowhere, silent as a canyon shadow, and dealt death like a vengeful spirit. "You think any ordinary cowpoke handles a gun like that? That ain't no trail drifter, that's a ranger, come to see about the rot in San Carlos." Every eye, including Rip's, instinctively measured the tall, gaunt figure on the rim. Rip Campbell, though taken by surprise, understood in a cold flash the lifeline Simpson had thrown. He didn't move, didn't speak. He let his cold gaze sweep over them, his face an unreadable mask of stone beneath the brim of his Stetson. He held the Colt with a steadiness that belied the turmoil in his chest, its dark muzzle an unwavering promise. Let them wonder. Let them fear. The lean deputy, Mort Brule, if Rip had heard right in the earlier exchange, shifted uneasily. "Sheriff," he muttered, his voice low but carrying in the stillness, "Ranger's got a long reach. If he is one." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung heavy as a shroud. Duffy's face was a study in conflict. Greed, brutality, and now a creeping, insidious fear chased each other across his features. He'd seen the stranger on the rim take down Carp Tustin with a single, perfectly placed shot that had seemed almost contemptuous in its deadly efficiency. He'd felt the man's bullet pluck at his own sleeve moments before. This Campbell was no ordinary saddle tramp. What if Simpson, in his dying throes, spoke truth? The thought of a Texas Ranger investigating Cal Blount's murder, Roy Stover's frame-up, and the whole Leaning L operation was enough to make beads of sweat pop out on Duffy's forehead despite the dry desert heat. "He ain't said nothin'," Duffy blustered, more to convince himself than his men. "He ain't confirmed it." He looked up at Rip. "You, Campbell, you a ranger?" Rip offered no reply. He merely adjusted his stance slightly, the movement economical and vaguely menacing. He let the vast, echoing silence of the canyon be his answer, a silence that seemed to magnify the quiet authority of his presence. He was, as Simpson had guessed, a man who looked like he belonged to something bigger, something more relentless than a mere posse of crooked lawmen. The ferret-faced man, Toby, began to edge backward, his eyes darting between Rip and the pathway out of the canyon. "Sheriff, maybe we should reconsider. If there's a mistake." "Mistake?" Duffy roared, but the conviction was draining from his voice like water from a leaky canteen. He glared at Simpson, who met his gaze with a faint, pain-filled smile. "This is a trap, that's what it is. A bluff." "Then call it, Duffy," Simpson challenged, his voice weakening. "Call his bluff. See if you can stomach the consequences when the rest of his company rides in. They travel light and fast, Rangers do. And they don't take kindly to their own being gunned down by tin-horn sheriffs and their hired killers." The mention of a company of Rangers struck another chord of fear. Brule took a definitive step back. "I ain't tangling with no Rangers, Sheriff. Not for what Gardner's paying." "Hold your nerve, Mort," Duffy snapped, but his eyes kept flicking towards the canyon rim, towards the silent, ominous figure who held their lives in his hands. Rip Campbell. The name meant nothing, but the man radiated a lethal competence that was deeply unsettling. The setting sun, beginning its slow descent, cast long, distorted shadows that writhed and danced like specters, adding to the growing sense of unease. The very rocks seemed to watch, ancient and knowing. Duffy was a bully and a grafter, not a foolhardy gunfighter when the odds turned truly uncertain and potentially fatal to his ambitions. He thought of Brock Gardner, of the Leaning L, and the intricate web they had spun. A Texas Ranger, nosing around, could bring it all crashing down. He looked at the still form of Carp Tustin, a testament to the stranger's deadly skill. He looked at Simpson, bleeding out but defiant. He looked at his two remaining men, their nerve clearly unraveling. With a curse that was more frustration than fury, Duffy slowly, reluctantly lowered his rifle. "All right, Ranger," he spat, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "If that's what you are, we'll withdraw. For now. But this ain't over. We'll get to the bottom of this." He didn't sound convincing, even to himself. Rip remained motionless, a sentinel, carved from the very stone of the canyon. He watched as Duffy gestured curtly to Brule and Toby. "Mount up. We're heading back to San Carlos." The retreat was not the panicked scattering of dry leaves Simpson might have envisioned, not at first. It was a sullen, wary withdrawal, each man acutely aware of the Colt still leveled from the rim. Brule and Toby practically scrambled for their horses, tethered further down the canyon. Duffy, his face suffused with a dark, impotent rage, backed away more slowly, his eyes still locked on Rip. He mounted his horse, a big chestnut gelding, and reined it around sharply. Then, as if a collective dam of fear finally broke, the three of them spurred their mounts, their departure escalating from a retreat to a near rout. The clatter of hooves against loose rock echoed wildly, fading as they galloped away, eager to put distance between themselves and the deadly enigma on the rim. They didn't look back. The dust of their departure hung in the air, slowly mingling with the smoke from the spent cartridges. An almost unnatural quiet settled over the canyon, broken only by Simpson's ragged breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling in the vast, indifferent sky. Rip Campbell finally allowed himself a slow breath, the tension coiling within him easing, but not disappearing. The bluff had worked. For now. He lowered the Colt, though his grip remained firm on its worn walnut stock. His eyes, however, were filled with a new array of questions that Simpson's desperate gamble had raised. He started to pick his way carefully down the treacherous slope, his gaze fixed on the wounded rancher. Simpson watched him approach, a flicker of something unreadable in his pain-glazed eyes. As Rip reached the canyon floor, the scent of blood thick in the air, he knelt beside the grizzled rancher. Simpson's shirt was a sodden mess of crimson, and his skin had a pale, waxy sheen. "That was a risky play, old man," Rip said, his voice low and gravelly. "What made you think they'd swallow that yarn about a ranger?" Simpson coughed again, then a grimace of pain twisted his features. "Had to do something. They'd have finished us both." He paused, gathering his fading strength. "Besides, you look the part, son. And you sure as hell fight like one." His eyes, surprisingly sharp despite his condition, bored into Rip's. "But that ain't the most pressing matter. We ain't got much time. They aim to hang Roy Stover by morning light." Chapter 5. He's a ranger, blast your hides. A Texas Ranger. The words, raw and laced with pain, ripped through the echoing din of gunfire that had turned the canyon into a slaughter pen. Jim Simpson, his face a mask of bloody dust and agonizing effort, pushed himself fractionally higher against the rough stone that was both his shield and his prison. His voice, surprisingly potent for a man leaking life onto the parched earth, clawed its way above the roar of Rip Shin's avenging Colt and the answering snarl of the posse's weapons. A sudden, ringing silence descended, so profound it seemed the desert itself held its breath. Smoke, acrid and biting, drifted in lazy plumes across the canyon floor, momentarily obscuring the figures below. Rip, crouched behind a weathered slab of granite on the rim, felt the unexpected declaration strike him with the force of a physical blow. His own Colt, still hot and bucking from the recent dispatch of the squat gunman who'd murdered Simpson in cold blood, lowered a fraction. His eyes, chips of glacial ice, remained fixed on the men below, trying to pierce the settling haze. Sheriff Tom Duffy, his massive frame momentarily frozen mid-stride, swiveled his head towards Simpson. Even from the rim, Rip could see the incredulity warring with a new, unwelcome flicker of apprehension in the lawman's porcine eyes. The tall, lean deputy beside him, a man whose face seemed hewn from sun-dried leather and malice, also paused, his rifle halfway to his shoulder. The third man, a jumpy, ferret-faced individual Rip had barely glimpsed, went utterly still near the mouth of a shallow wash. "A ranger?" Duffy's voice, when it came, was a hoarse rasp, stripped of its earlier bluster. "Simpson, you're delirious with blood loss. There ain't no ranger called to this." Rip remained silent, his mind racing. He knew the reputation of the Texas Rangers. Men who rode where they willed, answered to few, and often brought a harsh, unyielding justice to the lawless corners of the frontier. They were a specter that haunted men like Duffy, a potential reckoning that could unravel carefully constructed webs of corruption with ruthless efficiency. Simpson's desperate ploy was a wild gamble, a flimsy shield thrown up in a hurricane, yet the very air in the canyon seemed to thicken with its audacious possibility. "Delirious, am I?" Simpson coughed, a raw, wet sound. "Look at him, Duffy. Look at the way he fights." Came out of nowhere, silent as a canyon shadow, and dealt death like a vengeful spirit. "You think any ordinary cowpoke handles a gun like that?" That ain't no trail drifter, that's a ranger, come to see about the rot in San Carlos. Every eye, including Rip's, instinctively measured the tall, gaunt figure on the rim. Rip Shin, though taken by surprise, understood in a cold flash the lifeline Simpson had thrown. He didn't move, didn't speak. He let his cold gaze sweep over them, his face an unreadable mask of stone beneath the brim of his Stetson. He held the Colt with a steadiness that belied the turmoil in his chest, its dark muzzle an unwavering promise. Let them wonder. Let them fear. The lean deputy, Mort Brule, if Rip had heard right in the earlier exchange, shifted uneasily. "Sheriff," he muttered, his voice low but carrying in the stillness, "Ranger's got a long reach. If he is one." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung heavy as a shroud. Duffy's face was a study in conflict. Greed, brutality, and now a creeping, insidious fear chased each other across his features. He'd seen the stranger on the rim take down Carp Tustin with a single, perfectly placed shot that had seemed almost contemptuous in its deadly efficiency. He'd felt the man's bullet pluck at his own sleeve moments before. This Shin was no ordinary saddle tramp. What if Simpson, in his dying throes, spoke truth? The thought of a Texas Ranger investigating Cal Blount's murder, Roy Stover's frame-up, and the whole Leaning L operation was enough to make beads of sweat pop out on Duffy's forehead despite the dry desert heat. "He ain't said nothin'," Duffy blustered, more to convince himself than his men. "He ain't confirmed it." He looked up at Rip. "You, Shin. You a ranger?" Rip offered no reply. He merely adjusted his stance slightly, the movement economical and vaguely menacing. He let the vast, echoing silence of the canyon be his answer, a silence that seemed to magnify the quiet authority of his presence. He was, as Simpson had guessed, a man who looked like he belonged to something bigger, something more relentless than a mere posse of crooked lawmen. The ferret-faced man, Toby, began to edge backward, his eyes darting between Rip and the pathway out of the canyon. "Sheriff, maybe we should reconsider. If there's a mistake." "Mistake?" Duffy roared, but the conviction was draining from his voice like water from a leaky canteen. He glared at Simpson, who met his gaze with a faint, pain-filled smile. "This is a trap, that's what it is. A bluff." "Then call it, Duffy," Simpson challenged, his voice weakening. "Call his bluff. See if you can stomach the consequences when the rest of his company rides in. They travel light and fast, Rangers do. And they don't take kindly to their own being gunned down by tin-horn sheriffs and their hired killers." The mention of a company of Rangers struck another chord of fear. Brule took a definitive step back. "I ain't tangling with no Rangers, Sheriff. Not for what Gardner's paying." "Hold your nerve, Mort," Duffy snapped, but his eyes kept flicking towards the canyon rim, towards the silent, ominous figure who held their lives in his hands. Rip Shin. The name meant nothing, but the man radiated a lethal competence that was deeply unsettling. The setting sun, beginning its slow descent, cast long, distorted shadows that writhed and danced like specters, adding to the growing sense of unease. The very rocks seemed to watch, ancient and knowing. Duffy was a bully and a grafter, not a foolhardy gunfighter when the odds turned truly uncertain and potentially fatal to his ambitions. He thought of Brock Gardner, of the Leaning L, and the intricate web they had spun. A Texas Ranger, nosing around, could bring it all crashing down. He looked at the still form of Carp Tustin, a testament to the stranger's deadly skill. He looked at Simpson, bleeding out but defiant. He looked at his two remaining men, their nerve clearly unraveling. With a curse that was more frustration than fury, Duffy slowly, reluctantly lowered his rifle. "All right, Ranger," he spat, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "If that's what you are, we'll withdraw. For now. But this ain't over. We'll get to the bottom of this." He didn't sound convincing, even to himself. Rip remained motionless, a sentinel, carved from the very stone of the canyon. He watched as Duffy gestured curtly to Brule and Toby. "Mount up. We're heading back to San Carlos." The retreat was not the panicked scattering of dry leaves Simpson might have envisioned, not at first. It was a sullen, wary withdrawal, each man acutely aware of the Colt still leveled from the rim. Brule and Toby practically scrambled for their horses, tethered further down the canyon. Duffy, his face suffused with a dark, impotent rage, backed away more slowly, his eyes still locked on Rip. He mounted his horse, a big chestnut gelding, and reined it around sharply. Then, as if a collective dam of fear finally broke, the three of them spurred their mounts, their departure escalating from a retreat to a near rout. The clatter of hooves against loose rock echoed wildly, fading as they galloped away, eager to put distance between themselves and the deadly enigma on the rim. They didn't look back. The dust of their departure hung in the air, slowly mingling with the smoke from the spent cartridges. An almost unnatural quiet settled over the canyon, broken only by Simpson's ragged breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling in the vast, indifferent sky. Rip Shin finally allowed himself a slow breath, the tension coiling within him easing, but not disappearing. The bluff had worked. For now. He lowered the Colt, though his grip remained firm on its worn walnut stock. His eyes, however, were filled with a new array of questions that Simpson's desperate gamble had raised. He started to pick his way carefully down the treacherous slope, his gaze fixed on the wounded rancher. Simpson watched him approach, a flicker of something unreadable in his pain-glazed eyes. As Rip reached the canyon floor, the scent of blood thick in the air, he knelt beside the grizzled rancher. Simpson's shirt was a sodden mess of crimson, and his skin had a pale, waxy sheen. "That was a risky play, old man," Rip said, his voice low and gravelly. "What made you think they'd swallow that yarn about a ranger?" Simpson coughed again, then a grimace of pain twisted his features. "Had to do something. They'd have finished us both." He paused, gathering his fading strength. "Besides, you look the part, son. And you sure as hell fight like one." His eyes, surprisingly sharp despite his condition, bored into Rip's. "But that ain't the most pressing matter. We ain't got much time. They aim to hang Roy Stover by morning light." Chapter 6. By morning light. Rip echoed, the words dropping like stones into the sudden, heavy silence of the canyon. He knelt beside Jim Simpson, the metallic scent of blood sharp in his nostrils, the grim reality of his partner's peril a cold fist tightening around his heart. The Ranger bluff had bought them a reprieve, but time, it seemed, was a luxury they didn't possess. "We need to stop the bleeding, old man. Then you can tell me everything." Simpson's breathing was shallow, each inhale a rasping labor. His weathered face, normally ruddy from sun and wind, was now tinged with an ominous gray beneath the grime and blood. "Ain't much can be done for this leak, Campbell," he wheezed, his gaze fixed on Rip with a desperate intensity. "More important, you know what you're up against. What Roy's up against." Rip's jaw tightened. He tore strips from his own bandana with quick practiced movements, his hands surprisingly gentle as he began to pack the rancher's profusely bleeding shoulder wound. The bullet had gone clean through, but the damage was severe. "Talk then, Simpson. And save your strength." The sun bled crimson and gold across the western sky, painting the towering canyon walls in hues of fire and shadow. The air grew cooler, carrying the faint scent of distant rain and the dry, earthy perfume of the desert night. "It was Cal Blunt," Simpson began, his voice thin but steady, each word costing him. "Cattle buyer. Known him for years, mostly honest for a buyer." A faint, grim smile touched his lips. "He was out at my ranch, the 8x8, 2 weeks back. Looking to buy up a sizable herd I was trailing in from the high country." Rip nodded, his focus on staunching the flow of blood, but his ears strained to catch every syllable. The 8x8. So this was Simpson's spread. We'd about struck a deal, Simpson continued, his eyes clouding with the memory. Blunt was carrying a hefty poke. Gold, mostly. He was to pay me the next day in San Carlos, finalize the paperwork. He rode out from my place late afternoon, heading for town. Simpson's breath hitched. He never made it. A hawk laid on the wing, shrieked far overhead, its cry a lonely lament in the deepening twilight. They found him halfway to town, ambushed. Shot dead. Simpson paused, fighting for air. And your partner, Roy Stover, they said he did it. Rip's hands stilled for a moment. Roy. A dry gulcher. A murderer. The accusation was so alien to the man he knew. The fiery, sometimes reckless but always bedrock honest Roy Stover, that it was like accusing the sun of rising in the west. Roy wouldn't do that, Rip stated, his voice flat, devoid of doubt. No, he wouldn't, Simpson agreed, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. But they had witnesses, Campbell. 3 of them. Swore on a stack of Bibles. They saw Roy argue with Blunt on the trail, saw him draw down and fire. Claimed Roy robbed him, then lit out. Witnesses? Rip's mind reeled. It sounded too neat, too clean. Who were they? Couple of drifters who'd been hanging around San Carlos. Men no one really knew. And one of Brock Gardner's riders from the Leaning L. The name Gardner and Leaning L hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implication. Rip had heard whispers of the Leaning L outfit on his ride into the territory, a sprawling ranch with a reputation for hard men and harder dealings. Gardner, Rip repeated slowly. What's his stake in this? Simpson coughed, a racking sound that sent a fresh tremor of pain through his body. Rip offered him a sip of water from his canteen, which the rancher accepted with a grateful nod. Gardner, he runs things in these parts or tries to. Sheriff Duffy, that blowhard you just sent packing. He's Gardner's man, bought and paid for. Duffy made the arrest, quick as you please. Had Roy clapped in irons, before anyone could ask too many questions. He took another, shallow breath. I tried to speak up. Told Duffy that Blunt had left my place peaceably, that Roy wasn't even in the area when it must have happened. Stover had ridden into my camp the day before Blunt was killed, asking for work, said he was meeting a partner, you, I reckon. He was miles away, helping my boys with a bog-stuck steer when Blunt was gunned down. So you had proof. An alibi for Roy. My word against 3 others, one of them a Leaning L man. Duffy just laughed. Said, I was an old fool trying to protect a killer. Then the witnesses disappeared right after the hearing. Paid off and sent packing, I figure. Simpson's voice grew weaker, his eyelids beginning to droop. They rushed the trial. Judge in Gardner's pocket too, I suspect. It was a mockery, Campbell. A frame-up, pure and simple. Rip finished tying off the makeshift bandage. It was a poor effort, but it might slow the bleeding enough to give Simpson a fighting chance. The story the rancher told painted a grim picture of corruption and cold-blooded conspiracy. Roy, always one to chase a big deal, had ridden straight into a viper's nest. Why Simpson? Rip asked, his voice urgent. Why frame Roy? What did Blunt have that Gardner wanted badly enough to kill for? And why pin it on my partner? That's the part one ain't fully pieced together, Simpson admitted, his voice now barely a whisper. Blunt was carrying more than just cattle money. Heard talk, he'd stumbled onto something. Something Gardner wanted kept quiet. Or maybe Roy just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, a convenient scapegoat. His eyes searched Rip's. Or perhaps Stover knew something himself, something he told Blunt. The fading light cast long, eerie shadows, turning familiar rock formations into grotesque caricatures. The silence pressed in, amplifying the chirr of unseen insects and the soft rustle of the night wind through the sparse desert scrub. "They mean to hang him," Simpson repeated, the words a ghostly echo of his earlier warning. "The good folk of San Carlos are riled up. Lynch mob's been forming. Duffy's barely holding them back. Says he's for legal justice, but I reckon he's just waiting for the right moment, or for Gardner's signal. They want Roy silenced, and an example made." Rip felt a cold fury building within him, a rage as potent and dangerous as a coiled rattler. Roy, his red-headed compadre, the man who'd shared countless campfires and faced danger by his side, was to swing for a crime he didn't commit, a pawn in some desert baron's deadly game. "This Gardner," Rip said, his voice like flint. "Where can I find him?" "Leaning L headquarters, north of town. Big spread. But he's slippery. And always surrounded by his gunslingers." Simpson's gaze drifted, his strength ebbing. "Mort Brule, the tall one with Duffy, he's one of Gardner's top hands. And Carp Tustin, the one you shot, he was another." So, the men who'd ambushed Simpson were part of the frame. It all began to connect, a dark, tangled web of deceit and murder. "You need a doctor, Simpson," Rip said, his mind already racing ahead, planning, calculating. San Carlos. The jail. The lynch mob. "Too late for me, I figure," the old rancher murmured, his eyes half closed. "But not for Stover. You gotta clear his name, Campbell. He's a good man, an honest man." "I know," Rip said softly. He looked at the rancher, a man who'd fought bravely against overwhelming odds, a man who'd risked everything for a principle, and perhaps for a young, red-headed cowboy he barely knew but believed to be innocent. "I'll get him out, Simpson. And I'll find out who's behind this, and why." Simpson gave a faint nod, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "The 8x8, if you make it through this, anything I have, it's yours." His voice trailed off, and his breathing became even more shallow. Rip felt a surge of admiration and a profound sadness for the dying rancher. He had revealed the secrets of the 8x8, secrets that had cost him dearly but had given Rip the bare threads of the truth. Now, the task of unraveling the full conspiracy fell to him. He gently adjusted the crude bandage one last time. The desert night had fully descended, and the first stars were beginning to pierce the darkening velvet sky. An immense loneliness settled upon the canyon, the silence broken only by Simpson's weakening breaths. Rip knew the rancher didn't have long. He also knew he couldn't stay. Roy's life hung by a thread that would snap with the rising sun if he didn't act. With a final look at the brave, battered man who had trusted him with the truth, Rip Campbell rose to his full height. He checked his Colt, the feel of its familiar weight a grim reassurance. He had a long, dangerous ride ahead, into the heart of a corrupt town, against a man who held all the cards. He had to find a way to turn the tables, to expose the liars and save his partner. He took one last look at Simpson, then turned towards where Buck, his bay gelding, waited patiently in the shadows. The first step was getting to San Carlos, and getting there fast. He had to find out more about this Brock Gardner and his leaning L riders. He needed leverage, proof, something to break through the wall of lies Duffy and Gardner had constructed. As he reached his horse, a new desperate thought struck him. If there were witnesses who swore they saw Roy, what if one of them could be found, made to talk? Chapter 7. The gritty scrape of Rip Campbell's boots on the canyon trail faded as he urged Buck, his bay gelding, into a ground-eating lope. Behind him, in the deepening indigo shadows, lay Jim Simpson, his lifeblood seeping into the unforgiving Arizona dust, a testament to the ruthlessness of the forces Rip now knew he faced. There had been no more words from the rancher after his last whispered plea for Roy Stover, only a shallow sigh, a final stillness that spoke more eloquently than any further confession. Simpson had paid the ultimate price for his knowledge and his courage. The stars blazed with a fierce, cold light in the vast expanse of the desert sky, offering no comfort, only an indifferent audience to the solitary rider's grim passage. Each hoofbeat on the hard-packed earth was a drumbeat, measuring the dwindling moments of Roy's life. Simpson's words, raw and laden with the truth he'd bartered his life for, echoed in Rip's mind, slowly coalescing into a chilling tableau of calculated evil. Brock Gardner. The Leaning L, the name which Rip had only vaguely registered before as a significant power in the territory, now took on a sinister prominence, becoming the dark sun around which all the other players revolved. Simpson had painted him as the architect, the silent hand guiding the conspiracy. Mort Brule, the lean-faced gunman who had fled the canyon, and Carp Tustin, now silenced forever by Rip's Colt, were Gardner's instruments, the brute force to execute his designs. Rip pictured the scene as Simpson had laid it bare. Cal Blunt, the cattle buyer, leaving the 8x8 with a pouch heavy with gold, riding towards San Carlos. Then the ambush, swift and brutal. And Roy, his honest, unsuspecting partner, a man whose only crime was perhaps a thirst for a new venture and a trusting nature, conveniently chosen as the scapegoat. 3 witnesses, Simpson had said, one a Leaning L rider, appearing as if from thin air to swear they saw Roy pull the trigger. It was a frame, all right, meticulously crafted, perfectly timed. The cool night air, carrying the scent of sage and distant pine, did little to cool the hot anger simmering in Rip's gut. He thought of Roy's letter, partner following a lead on something big. Something doesn't smell right about this deal. Roy had sensed the poison in the water, but his inherent optimism, his belief in the possibility of a big strike, had led him into the snare. And Sheriff Tom Duffy? Simpson had called him Gardner's man bought and paid for. Rip had seen the man's bluster, his easy descent into violence, the clear corruption that clung to him like the trail dust. Yet the outline in Rip's mind, drawn from the dying rancher's gasps and his own grim understanding of frontier justice twisted awry, hinted at something more. Was Duffy a full partner in the conspiracy's darkest secrets, or merely a pawn, albeit a willing one, moved by Gardner's hand? The phrase unwitting tool from some deeper recess of understanding began to form. Perhaps Duffy, for all his venality, didn't know the full depth of Gardner's scheme. He was a man content to line his pockets, to enforce the law as dictated by the highest bidder, happy to look the other way or railroad an innocent man if the price was right. Gardner would have fed him just enough of the story to ensure his cooperation. Perhaps that Blunt was a rival, or that Stover was a genuine troublemaker whose removal would benefit the peaceful running of the territory as Gardner saw it. Duffy, in his greed and moral blindness, would ask few questions, content with his piece of the pie, never seeing the intricate machinery of the larger plot whirring just beyond his limited perception. He was a tool, certainly, and his ignorance of the true deeper motives, the something big Roy had chased, the secrets Blunt might have carried beyond mere cattle money, made him an unwitting one in the grander, more nefarious design. This Brock Gardner, then, was the true puppet master. He didn't just pull Duffy's strings, he orchestrated the entire deadly play. He had the resources, the riders, the cold-blooded vision to conceive and execute such a plot. The Leaning L wasn't just a ranch. It was the seat of a shadow empire built on fear and financed by corruption. The ambush of Simpson wasn't just to silence a man who knew too much about Roy's innocence. It was to eliminate a threat to Gardner's entire operation, a man who dared to question his authority. Buck tossed his head, snorting as he navigated a patch of loose shale, the sound jarring Rip from his dark reverie. The trail was beginning to climb, winding through a series of low rolling hills. San Carlos couldn't be far now. The thought of the town, the jail, the lynch mob thirsting for Roy's blood spurred him onward. The perfection of the frame was its most damnable quality. The vanished witnesses, the compliant sheriff, the rushed trial, all designed to create an unshakable edifice of guilt around Roy Stover. Gardner had woven a tight net. But every net had a weak point, a place where a determined hand could find a tear. The leaning L rider who testified, he was a loose thread. If he could be found, made to talk, but that was a long shot, a desperate hope against a ticking clock. Rip's hand instinctively went to the Colt at his hip, its worn grip a familiar comfort. He was one man against a powerful, entrenched conspiracy. Simpson was dead. Roy was facing a hangman's noose. The odds were impossibly long. Yet a cold, hard resolve settled in Rip's heart. He owed it to Roy, his steadfast partner. He owed it to Simpson, who had died believing in justice. He would not let this stand. The land around him was starkly beautiful in the starlight, the mesas and buttes etched in silver and black. It was a land of harsh realities and sudden death, but also a land of immense freedom, a freedom Gardner and his ilk sought to choke with their greed and violence. Rip Campbell had ridden into Arizona territory following a cold trail, seeking a missing friend. Now that trail had become a path of vengeance and a desperate race against time. He was no lawman, no Texas Ranger, as Simpson had proclaimed in that desperate life-saving bluff. He was just a cowpuncher, but he was a cowpuncher who understood loyalty and who knew right from wrong. And he knew that Brock Gardner and the leaning L had to be stopped. As Buck crested a small rise, Rip saw them in the distance, the faint scattered lights of San Carlos twinkling like fallen stars in the vast darkness. A fragile beacon in a sea of peril. It was there, in that rough mining town, that Roy awaited his fate. It was there that the leaning L conspiracy held sway. And it was there that Rip Campbell would have to make his stand. He urged Buck forward, the lights of San Carlos growing steadily brighter, a silent promise of the confrontation to come. The wind picked up, whistling a mournful tune through the chaparral, like a dirge for what the morning might bring. Chapter 8. String him up come sunrise, I tell ya. That red-headed killer ain't gonna see another noon. The voice, harsh and thick with whiskey, sliced through the cool night air as Rip Campbell guided Buck into the deeper shadows of a livery stable on the outskirts of San Carlos. He swung down, his movements stiff from the long, urgent ride, every muscle aching with fatigue, yet his senses were strung tight as a bowstring. He'd arrived. And trouble, it seemed, had arrived before him, setting up camp right in the heart of town. Two men stumbled out of a nearby saloon, their silhouettes stark against the yellow lamplight spilling from its swinging doors. One, a portly fellow with a self-important air, jabbed a finger towards the center of town. Sheriff Duffy's got him under lock and key, but the boys are getting restless. Blunt was a popular man, and that Stover fella, well, an outsider killin' one of our own don't sit right. Right is what a rope makes it, Henderson, the other man slurred, a lanky individual with a cruel twist to his mouth. Gardner's leaning L boys are in town too. They ain't keen on waitin' for no circuit judge. Justice delayed is justice denied, they say. Rip tethered Buck in a dark stall, the scent of hay and old leather a fleeting, almost forgotten comfort. He gave the gelding a quick rub-down, his mind racing. Sunrise. That was the deadline. The words confirmed the dread that had been his constant companion since Jim Simpson had uttered his dying warning. Roy Stover, his fiery loyal partner, was marked for death, and the clock was ticking with relentless, savage speed. San Carlos pulsed with a low, menacing hum, an undercurrent of violence barely held in check. Unlike the desolate silence of the canyon he'd left behind, the town was a hive of agitated energy. Groups of men stood on street corners, their voices low and angry. Torches flared sporadically, casting flickering, hellish shadows on the rough-hewn adobe walls of the buildings. It was the unmistakable atmosphere of a town teetering on the brink of mob rule, a place where reason had been drowned in cheap whiskey and a thirst for vengeance. Rip pulled his Stetson lower, melting into the deeper darkness that hugged the alleyways. He needed to see the lay of the land, to understand the full measure of the forces arrayed against Roy. His first priority was the jail. He moved like a wraith, his tall frame gliding through the narrow passages between buildings, his boots making no sound on the packed earth. The main street was more crowded. Men, their faces grim or flushed with excitement, moved with a common purpose towards a squat, formidable-looking structure that Rip guessed was the jailhouse. The air thrummed with a palpable bloodlust. He heard snippets of conversation, brutal and direct. "Get it over with, make an example. Ain't no need for a trial when guilt's plain as the nose on your face." A hulking figure stood on the steps of a mercantile, his voice booming across the gathering crowd. Rip recognized the type, a rabble-rouser, feeding the mob's ugliest appetites. Cal Blunt was a good man, a friend to many. Struck down in cold blood by this drifter, this Roy Stover. Are we to wait while fancy lawyers from Prescott tie us up in knots? Are we to let this killer cheat the hangman's due? A roar of denial went up from the crowd. No. Hang him. Hang him now. Rip felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. These weren't just angry citizens. This was a pack, their individual identities submerged in a collective hunger for a life. Exposing the truth to them would be like trying to reason with a wildfire. He skirted the edge of the crowd, his eyes scanning for leaning L-brands, for the faces of men who carried themselves with the swagger of hired guns. He saw several, their expressions contemptuous and eager, clearly stoking the flames, guiding the mob's fury. Gardner's hand was evident here too, subtly directing the storm. The jail itself was a solid-looking building of stone and thick timber, its windows small and barred. Two men with shotguns stood guard on the porch, their figures silhouetted against the lamplight from within. One of them, Rip noted with a surge of grim recognition, was the ferret-faced deputy, Toby, who had fled the canyon with Duffy and Mort Brule. His presence here confirmed the direct link between the sheriff's office and Gardner's conspiracy. The other guard was a burly unknown, his face set in an impassive mask. Rip knew he couldn't just walk up and demand Roy's release. He needed leverage, something to crack the wall of lies Gardner had built. But time was his most pressing enemy. Before another sunset painted the desert sky, Roy would be dead. The thought spurred a desperate urgency. He found a vantage point in the unlit doorway of a closed assay office across the street, watching the jail, observing the ebb and flow of the mob. The crowd was growing, their mood turning uglier with each passing moment, fueled by liquor and the inflammatory words of Gardner's agitators. They were like wolves circling, waiting for the signal to close in for the kill. What could one man do against so many? Against a conspiracy so deeply entrenched, it had the law itself in its pocket. The memory of Jim Simpson's courage, his lonely stand, pricked at Rip's conscience. He couldn't let Roy die like this. He had to try something, anything. His mind sifted through desperate options. Could he create a diversion? Try to pick off the guards? Attempt a stealthy entry? Each plan seemed fraught with peril, likely to end in his own death and do little to save Roy. But doing nothing was not an option. The lights of a larger, more boisterous saloon, the Silver Spur, spilled onto the street nearby. Perhaps Duffy himself was in there, confident his prisoner was secure, or maybe some of Gardner's key men were celebrating their imminent victory. Information was still key. If he could learn more about their plans, their numbers, the precise timing. He considered the risk. Walking into a saloon full of hostile men, a stranger in a town on edge, was tantamount to walking into a den of rattlesnakes. But the image of Roy, trapped and facing a brutal end, pushed him forward. He had to find an opening, a crack in their armor. The crowd around the jail surged again, a fresh wave of angry shouts washing over the street. "Bring him out, Duffy. Bring out the killer." Toby and the other guard shifted uneasily, their shotguns held a little tighter. From inside the jail, Rip heard a muffled shout, authoritative and harsh, likely Duffy trying to maintain control, or perhaps just playing his part for the crowd. Rip's decision solidified. He couldn't wait for an opportunity to present itself. He had to make one. He'd start with the sheriff. If he could somehow isolate Duffy, force a confrontation, perhaps he could learn anything that could be used. It was a long shot, a fool's errand, but it was better than watching the sand run out of Roy's hourglass from the shadows. He straightened his shoulders, his face set in grim lines. The weariness from the trail, the sorrow for Simpson, the cold fury at the injustice, all of it coalesced into a steely resolve. He stepped out from the darkened doorway, turning his steps not toward the volatile mob at the jail, but towards the side entrance of the sheriff's office, a narrow, unlit passage that likely led to a back room or Duffy's personal quarters. If he could confront the lawman alone, away from his cronies and the inflamed citizenry, perhaps, just perhaps, he could make the first crack in the Leaning L conspiracy. He moved quickly, silently down the alley, the raucous noise of the mob at his back, the weight of Roy's life pressing down on him with every step. Chapter 9. The narrow alley behind the San Carlos Sheriff's Office was a black maw, smelling faintly of stale beer and desperation. Rip Campbell moved with the silence of a hunting cat, his hand near his Colt, every nerve alive to the oppressive atmosphere of the town. He reached the back door, a sturdy plank affair with a rusted latch. He could hear the distant rhythmic roar of the lynch mob, a hungry beast baying for his partner's blood. But here, in the suffocating confines of the alley, a different, more personal tension coiled the air. He tested the latch. Unlocked. Easing the door inward a fraction, he peered into a dimly lit storage room cluttered with old saddles, wanted posters, and discarded ledgers. A sliver of light beckoned from beneath an inner door, accompanied by the low murmur of a single voice. "Duffy's." Rip slipped inside, the door whispering shut behind him. He crossed the storage room, each step measured, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. This was it. He had to make Duffy talk, to find some leverage, some piece of the truth that could save Roy. He reached the inner door, his hand hovering over the knob. Before he could act, before he could draw his weapon or utter a word, the floorboard directly behind him groaned under a sudden weight. Instinct, honed by years on the trail, screamed a warning. Rip started to turn, his hand flashing towards his Colt, but he was too late. A massive shadow loomed, and then a searing, explosive pain erupted at the base of his skull. The world fractured into a million blinding shards of light, then plunged into an abyss of roaring blackness. He felt his knees buckle, the hard-packed earth rushing up to meet him with brutal finality. His last conscious thought was of Roy, a fleeting image of his partner's red hair and defiant grin. Time ceased to exist. It might have been minutes or hours later when a dull, throbbing ache dragged Rip back to a hazy awareness. He lay on a cold, damp stone floor, the metallic taste of blood thick in his mouth. His head felt as though it had been split by a smith's hammer. He tried to move his hands, but they were bound tight behind him, the ropes biting cruelly into his wrists. His ankles were similarly secured. Groaning, he forced his eyes open. The light was dim, filtering from a single grime-caked lantern hanging from a low ceiling beam. He was in a cellar of some kind, the air thick with the smell of mildew and stale earth. Rough stone walls pressed in on all sides. "Well, look who decided to rejoin the living." The voice was laced with a cold amusement. Rip blinked, his vision slowly clearing. Mort Brule, Gardner's lean-faced gunman, stood a few feet away, casually rolling a cigarette. Two other Leaning L riders flanked him, their faces hard and impassive, their eyes glittering with a predatory light in the gloom. One of them held Rip's own Colt, examining it with a proprietary air. Rip's mind, still foggy from the blow, struggled to piece things together. Duffy. The alley. The sudden attack from behind. The sheriff hadn't been alone. He'd been waiting. A treacherous, cowardly ambush. Comfortable, Campbell? Brule drawled, striking a match on his thumbnail and lighting his cigarette. The flare briefly illuminated his harsh features, the scar that snaked down his left cheekbone. Or should I call you Ranger? That was a good one. Simpson's little play. Almost had us fooled. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Before Rip could muster a reply, a commotion from the far side of the cellar drew their attention. Heavy footsteps, a muffled curse, and then Sheriff Tom Duffy was shoved unceremoniously into the dim light, his hands also bound behind him. His face was a mask of bewildered fury and dawning fear. His fancy vest was askew, his sheriff's star glinting mockingly in the lantern light. Brule. What in the damnation is the meaning of this? Duffy blustered, his voice tight with indignation. Untie me at once. This is an outrage. I'm the sheriff of this county. Brule took a long drag from his cigarette, letting the smoke curl slowly from his nostrils. He regarded Duffy with an expression of utter contempt. Not anymore, Tom. Seems your usefulness has expired. Duffy's jaw dropped. Expired? What are you talking about? I brought you Campbell here, didn't I? Trussed up neat as a Christmas goose. Gardner will be pleased. He promised me a hefty bonus for this night's work. Oh, Gardner's pleased enough with Campbell's capture, Brule said, his voice silky smooth but edged with steel. He's less pleased with loose ends. And you, Duffy, are rapidly becoming a very loose end. The color drained from Duffy's face, replaced by a pasty, unhealthy pallor. Loose end. I don't understand. I did everything Gardner asked. I arrested Stover, arranged the witnesses, kept the mob from stringing him up too soon. I played my part. You played it well, Tom, Brule conceded with a mock bow. Right up until the stranger showed up asking too many questions, and our friend Simpson started singing like a canary before he cashed in his chips. Things got a little complicated. Gardner don't like complications. Rip watched the exchange through a haze of pain, his mind slowly sharpening. Duffy, the treacherous lawman who had clubbed him from behind, was now facing his own betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on him, even in his current predicament. The sheriff had thought he was a wolf among sheep, but he was merely a jackal, and now the true wolves were turning on him. But I'm loyal to Gardner. Duffy stammered, his bluster completely gone, replaced by a desperate pleading whine. I wouldn't say a word, I swear it. You can't do this. One of the other leaning L-men laughed, a short, brutal bark. Can't we? You got a lot of faith in a man like Brock Gardner, Sheriff. He ain't known for his sentimentality. Gardner wants a clean slate, Duffy, Brule explained, his eyes cold as a winter sky. No troublesome prisoners left to tell tales. No local lawmen who know too much about his business. With Stover hanged by the mob, and Campbell here silenced permanently, and you. Well, let's just say your sudden disappearance alongside these other troublemakers will be mighty convenient. Duffy stared at Brule, his mouth agape, the full horror of his situation finally dawning on him. He, Tom Duffy, the powerful sheriff of San Carlos, was now a prisoner, marked for death by the very men he had served. He was caught between the rock of his own corruption and the hard place of Gardner's ruthlessness. His world, built on a foundation of bullying and backroom deals, was crumbling around him. He looked wildly from Brule to the other gunman. Then his gaze fell on Rip, who lay watching him with a grim, pain-filled stoicism. For a moment their eyes met, the captor and the captured now sharing the same grim fate. Duffy saw no pity in Rip's eyes, only a bleak understanding. Brule stepped forward, grinding his cigarette butt under his heel on the stone floor. Boss will be here soon. He likes to personally oversee the final arrangements. He gestured towards Rip and Duffy with his chin. Make him comfortable, boys. Wouldn't want him catching a chill before the main event. The two leaning L-riders moved to secure Duffy more thoroughly, shoving him roughly against the damp wall beside Rip. The ex-sheriff, all fight gone out of him, slumped into his bonds a broken man. Rip tested his own ropes again, discreetly, but they were expertly tied. He was trapped, injured, and surrounded by killers. And now, even the corrupt lawman who had put him here was facing the same dark end. The bitter taste in his mouth wasn't just blood anymore. It was the acrid flavor of despair. He closed his eyes for a moment, the throbbing in his head intensifying, as Brule's parting words hung in the chilling air, a promise of what was to come. Chapter 10. The silence in the cellar stretched taut, broken only by Duffy's ragged, whimpering breaths and the dull throbbing in Rip Campbell's head. Mort Brule and his leaning L cohorts had settled into a grim, watchful patience, the lantern casting their elongated shadows like grotesque specters on the damp stone walls. Rip, despite the fire in his skull and the biting cruelty of his bonds, forced his mind to clarity, cataloging every detail, every nuance of his captor's demeanor. Hope was a distant star, almost invisible, but the will to fight, to survive, still flickered stubbornly within him. Footsteps, heavier and more deliberate than Brule's, echoed from the passage beyond the cellar door. A low murmur of voices, then the door creaked open, wider this time, admitting a figure who seemed to draw all the meager light in the room towards himself, leaving the corners in even deeper shadow. Brock Gardner had arrived. He was a man of middling height, but carried himself with an imposing stillness that spoke of absolute authority. His face, framed by iron-gray hair, was a mask of cold composure, his eyes the color of a winter river, missing nothing. He wore range clothes, practical but of a finer cut than his men, a Colt with an ivory grip nestled low on his hip. There was no bluster about him, no outward show of menace, just an aura of contained power that was far more chilling than any overt threat. This was the architect of Roy's ruin, the spider at the center of the web. He surveyed the scene with a slow, appraising gaze, Rip still and watchful despite his injuries, Duffy a trembling, abject wreck, Brule and his men now standing straighter, more alert in their boss's presence. He put up a fight, then? Gardner's voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it commanded the cellar's full attention. He gestured with his chin towards Rip. Not much of one, boss, Brule reported, a hint of deference now coloring his tone. Duffy here cold-cocked him from behind, before he could clear leather. Real brave, our sheriff was. A smirk played on Brule's lips as he glanced at the disgraced lawman. Gardner's lips thinned almost imperceptibly. He gave Duffy a look that was colder than the stone floor. Courage was never your long suit, was it, Tom? Duffy flinched as if struck. Mr. Gardner. Brock, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I'm still your man. I can be useful. Just tell me what you want. His voice was a desperate, croaking plea. Gardner ignored him, his attention settling fully on Rip. He walked closer, stopping a few feet away, studying the bound cowpuncher with an unnerving intensity. The mask he wore, if there ever truly was one, was gone. This was not the shrewd rancher dealing in cattle and land. This was the wolf, stripped bare of any pretense, his eyes reflecting a pragmatic ruthlessness. Rip Campbell, Gardner stated, not a question but a pronouncement. You've caused me a considerable amount of trouble. My associate, Mr. Tustin, is dead. My other associate, Mr. Brule here, was inconvenienced. And Jim Simpson, a man who should have learned long ago to mind his own business, is also no longer a concern. He paused. All because you couldn't leave well enough alone. Rip met Gardner's gaze, his own eyes burning with a cold, defiant light despite the pain that radiated through his body. Stover is innocent. You framed him. A flicker of something, surprise? Annoyance, crossed Gardner's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Innocence, he said, the word imbued with a faint derision, is a luxury few can afford in this territory, Mr. Campbell. Especially when it interferes with progress. Your partner stumbled into something that wasn't his concern. Cal Blunt made a similar mistake. So you admit it, Rip pressed, his voice raspy. You had Blunt killed. Gardner actually smiled then, a brief, chilling contortion of his lips that held no warmth, only a profound and unsettling cynicism. Let's just say Mr. Blunt was removed from a path where he was causing obstruction. And your partner was conveniently available to take the blame. A neat solution, I thought. Until you arrived. Brock, please. Duffy sobbed, fresh tears cutting new paths through the grime on his face. I didn't know anything about Blunt, I swear. I just did what you asked with Stover. I can keep quiet. No one will ever know. Gardner finally turned his gaze back to the former sheriff, his expression one of profound distaste. That, Tom, is where you are mistaken. You see, I have a very meticulous nature. I dislike loose ends, unanswered questions, and most of all, witnesses who might, under duress or perhaps a pang of conscience, however unlikely in your case, decide to talk. He began to pace slowly, his boot heels clicking on the stone. The good people of San Carlos are presently baying for Roy Stover's blood. They believe him to be a murderer. A swift public execution by lynch mob would satisfy their rustic sense of justice. He paused before Rip. And you, Mr. Campbell, you know far too much. Your continued existence poses an unacceptable risk. Then he stopped, in front of Duffy again. And you, Tom, you've been a useful, if somewhat witless instrument. But instruments can be turned against their masters. Your knowledge of my methods makes you a liability. Gardner came to a halt in the center of the small cellar, the lantern light casting his shadow large and menacing against the far wall. He looked from Rip to Duffy, then back to Rip. Therefore, he announced, his voice dropping to a level that was both intimate and deadly, to ensure that all narratives are appropriately concluded, that all potential voices of dissent are silenced, and that the truth, as I define it, is the only one that remains, I've arranged for a rather more comprehensive solution than a simple lynching. He let the silence hang for a moment, savoring their rapt, terrified attention. There will be a triple hanging, Gardner stated, the words falling like chips of ice into the fetid air of the cellar. Your partner, Roy Stover. You, Mr. Campbell. And you, Sheriff Duffy. A strangled gasp escaped Duffy. Rip remained outwardly impassive, but his heart hammered against his ribs. A triple hanging. It was a monstrous, audacious plan, designed to wipe the slate clean, to bury any evidence of Gardner's crimes deep in the Arizona earth along with their bodies. No one lives to tell the truth, Gardner continued, his eyes glittering. No awkward questions, no lingering doubts. Just 3 less troublemakers in the territory. 3 examples of what happens when men meddle in affairs that don't concern them, or when they fail to show the proper discretion. The masks were truly gone now. This was not just about a frame-up or silencing a few individuals. This was about absolute power, wielded with utter ruthlessness. Brock Gardner was not just a rancher. He was a king in his own brutal domain, and he would eliminate anyone who dared to challenge his reign. Duffy began to blubber incoherently, a torrent of pleas and promises that Gardner ignored as if he were swatting at a bothersome fly. Rip's mind, however, was already racing beyond the immediate horror of the pronouncement. He was looking for a flaw, a weakness, any desperate chance, however slim. Gardner turned to Mort Brule. "Take them up. Tie their horses. We'll use the old cottonwoods, down by the dry fork of Bitter Creek. It's secluded. Have Miguel and Chavez ride out to the jail and collect Stover. Tell them to be discreet. We don't want to alarm the good citizens just yet. We'll ensure justice is done before the town even knows we've taken a hand." His voice was crisp, efficient, the voice of a man issuing routine orders for a day's work. "Ensure they're ready by first light." Brule nodded. "Yes, boss." He gestured to his men. "All right, you heard him. Get these two on their feet. Let's get this over with." Chapter 11. "Get 'em on their feet," Mort Brule's voice rasped, devoid of any emotion save a weary impatience. "Sun'll be cracking the horizon soon, and the boss wants this business finished clean and quiet before San Carlos even knows Stover's missin' from his cot." One of the leaning L riders, a hulking man with a vacant stare named Jago, hauled Rip Campbell roughly to his feet. Pain lanced through Rip's skull from the earlier blow, and his bound wrists screamed in protest, but he locked his knees, refusing to give his captors the satisfaction of seeing him stumble. Beside him, Tom Duffy was a quivering mass of terror, his face ashen in the pre-dawn gloom that still clung to the rugged terrain outside the cellar. They were being herded like cattle to slaughter. "Brule, for God's sake, man," Duffy choked out, his voice thick with a desperate, unreasoning hope. "There's got to be something, some deal we can make. I got money saved. More than Gardner pays. Just let me go. I'll ride out, disappear, you'll never hear from Tom Duffy again." Brule didn't even bother to look at him. He merely spat onto the dusty ground. "Save your breath, Duffy. You dug your own grave when you hitched your wagon to Gardner and thought you were sittin' in the driver's seat. Some men just never learn who holds the reins." They were pushed towards their horses, tethered nearby. Another leaning L man, Chavez, a wiry, dark-featured individual with eyes that never seemed to rest, already had Roy Stover's horse saddled and waiting alongside Rip's bay buck. The thought of Roy, still locked away, oblivious to this final, treacherous journey, twisted like a knife in Rip's gut. The route Gardner had chosen for their execution led them away from San Carlos, plunging into a broken, arid landscape of jagged hills and shadowed arroyos that eventually spilled into the dry fork of Bitter Creek. The creek bed itself was a wide gash in the earth, littered with boulders and tangled thickets of mesquite and catclaw, its banks rising steeply on either side like the walls of a narrow canyon. The old cottonwoods, their gaunt limbs reaching towards the first pale streaks of dawn like skeletal arms, stood sentinel in the distance. Duffy stumbled repeatedly, his great bulk making the rough passage difficult. Each jolt seemed to drain him further of hope, his earlier desperate pleas giving way to a sullen, despairing silence. Rip, however, walked with a coiled alertness, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings, his mind a desperate calculator of infinitesimally small chances. His bonds were tight, expertly knotted, but he subtly worked his wrists, testing for any give, any fray in the rope. The big sheriff, trudging beside him, was a broken man. The betrayal by Gardner, a man he had served with a corrupt loyalty, had shattered whatever warped sense of order had governed his life. He had been a bully, a grafter, a man who used his badge as a shield for his own petty tyrannies, but he had believed himself a player in a larger game. Now, stripped of his authority, his illusions, and soon his life, he was nothing. The light of understanding that dawned in Duffy's eyes was not one of noble epiphany, but the stark, animalistic realization that his only path now was not to be broken, but to break whatever lay in his path, if only to go down fighting. They reached a particularly rough patch where the trail narrowed, forcing them to proceed in single file along a treacherous ledge overlooking the deeper cut of the creek bed. Jago, the hulking guard, was directly behind Duffy, prodding him impatiently with the barrel of his rifle. Brule rode ahead with Chavez, their vigilance perhaps a fraction looser now that they were nearing their grim destination. It was then that Duffy moved. There was no conscious thought behind it, no plan, only a sudden, convulsive explosion of pure, unadulterated terror and rage. With a sound that was half bellow, half sob, he threw his massive 250-pound frame backward and sideways, directly into Jago. The unexpectedness and sheer force of the maneuver caught Jago completely off guard. The big, leaning L rider grunted in surprise, his rifle clattering against the rock face as he struggled to maintain his balance on the narrow ledge. Duffy, roaring like a wounded bear, grappled with him, his bound hands useless as weapons but his weight and fury a potent force. "Get him off me," Jago yelled, teetering precariously. Brule and Chavez whirled their horses around, their curses sharp in the still air. For a moment, the scene was a chaotic tableau of struggling bodies, flailing limbs, and panicked shouts. Jago, desperately trying to stay on the ledge, swung his rifle butt wildly, connecting with Duffy's shoulder. The ex-sheriff roared again, undeterred, his arms encircling Jago in a bear hug of pure desperation, their combined weight too much for the crumbling edge of the path. With a shower of dislodged stones and a final terrified cry from Jago, both men plunged over the side, disappearing into the shadowed depths of the creek bed some 15 feet below. A sickening thud echoed upwards. In that instant of pandemonium, Rip Campbell saw his chance. The ropes on his wrists, abraded by his constant subtle working against their fibers and perhaps loosened by the jostling, gave way with a final desperate surge of strength. His hands were free. Chavez, his attention momentarily fixed on the spot where Duffy and Jago had vanished, had let his own rifle hang loose in its saddle scabbard. Brule, further ahead, was already dismounting, shouting orders, his focus split. Rip didn't hesitate. He launched himself at Chavez. He was weakened, his head still throbbing, but the adrenaline of a fighting chance surged through him like wildfire. He slammed into Chavez from the side, knocking the slighter man clean out of his saddle. They both hit the rocky ground, hard. Chavez yelped in pain and surprise, his hat flying off, his rifle skittering across the stones. Rip was on him in an instant, his freed hands searching, grasping. He felt the smooth, worn butt of Chavez's holstered pistol. With a surge of desperate strength, he wrenched it free. "Brule! He's loose!" Chavez shrieked, scrambling away from Rip like a crab. Mort Brule, already halfway down the slope into the creek bed to check on Jago, froze. He looked up, his face a mask of murderous fury, as he saw Rip Campbell, no longer a bound prisoner but an armed threat, staggering to his feet with Chavez's revolver clutched in his fist. Time seemed to slow. The first rays of the rising sun were just beginning to touch the highest peaks, painting them a bloody crimson. Down in the shadowed creek bed, death stalked, its presence palpable. "Kill him!" Brule snarled, drawing his own weapon, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. He fired, the shot echoing like a thunderclap in the narrow confines, the bullet whining past Rip's ear, kicking up a puff of dust from the rock face behind him. Lead filled the air. Rip threw himself behind a jagged outcrop of sandstone, the Colt in his hand bucking as he returned fire. Chavez, having recovered his own rifle, scrambled for cover, levering a shell into the chamber. From the creek bed below, a groan indicated that at least one of the men who had fallen was still alive. The desperate fight had begun. The silence of the desert was shattered by the roar of gunfire, the deadly rain of bullets seeking flesh and bone. Rip Campbell, battered and outnumbered, was finally armed, a cornered wolf turning on his tormentors with all the deadly ferocity he possessed. He sighted down the barrel of the borrowed Colt, his target the advancing figure of Mort Brule, and squeezed the trigger. Chapter 12. The borrowed Colt bucked in Rip Campbell's hand, its roar joining the deadly chorus that echoed through the narrow confines of Bitter Creek's dry fork. Mort Brule, caught in the open as he'd charged down the slope, grunted and staggered as Rip's slug tore through his thigh, pitching him forward into the dusty scree. The leaning L foreman's shot went wild, plowing harmlessly into the sandstone above Rip's head. Chavez, having retrieved his rifle, sent a desperate shot Rip's way, the bullet smacking into the rocks near Rip's shoulder with a vicious whine. Rip ducked lower behind his outcrop, the acrid scent of burnt powder sharp in his nostrils. He was still exposed, his position precarious. He needed better cover, and he needed his own gun, the familiar weight of his customized Colt Peacemaker. He risked a glance. Brule was trying to push himself up, his face contorted in agony and fury, his pistol still in his hand. Chavez was reloading, fumbling with cartridges, his eyes wide with fear but his intent still deadly. From the creek bed below, a pained groan confirmed that Jago, the hulking guard who had plunged over the ledge with Duffy, was alive, perhaps even still a threat. And Duffy himself. Rip had no idea of the sheriff's fate. Then Rip saw it. Jago, half buried in rubble near the creek bank, was groaning and trying to push himself up. Pinned beneath him, partially visible, was a gun belt, Rip's gun belt with his own Colt still holstered. Jago must have taken it when Rip was unconscious. It was a desperate gamble. Brule was bringing his gun around for another shot. Chavez was nearly reloaded. But Rip knew he wouldn't last long with just the unfamiliar revolver and limited ammunition. With a surge of raw adrenaline, he broke cover, not towards his enemies, but with a diagonal dash towards the steep, crumbling bank that led down into the creek bed. He scrambled, slid, and half fell down the incline, dust and pebbles cascading around him, presenting a fleeting, impossible target. Brule's shot seared the air where Rip had been a second before. Chavez's rifle cracked, the bullet tugging at Rip's torn sleeve. He ignored the near misses, his focus entirely on reaching his fallen captor and his own weapon. He hit the creek bed with a jarring impact, rolling to his feet near the groaning Jago. The big leaning L rider's eyes widened in disbelief and pain as he saw Rip. Jago's leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken in the fall, but his massive arms still possessed strength. He reached for Rip with a snarl. Rip didn't have time for a protracted struggle. He brought the barrel of Chavez's revolver down in a short, brutal arc on Jago's temple. The big man went limp with a sigh. Wasting no motion, Rip ripped his gun belt free, the familiar weight of his Colt a profound reassurance. He strapped it on, his fingers instinctively checking the loads, then drew his own Peacemaker. Now he had twin Colts, justice in each hand. A shout from above. Chavez, emboldened by Brule's covering fire, was scrambling down the bank after him. Rip spun, his newly acquired second Colt spitting flame. Chavez screamed, clutching his shoulder as the bullet spun him around, his rifle flying from his grasp. He collapsed in a heap, wounded but alive, his face a mask of agony. Rip turned his attention back to the ledge. Mort Brule, using a jutting rock for support, had managed to regain a firing position. His face was pale with blood loss, but his eyes burned with a fanatic's hatred. "You ain't leaving this canyon alive, Campbell," Brule yelled, his voice hoarse. He fired, the bullet kicking up dirt dangerously close to Rip's boot. Rip didn't waste words. He advanced, moving with a deadly grace among the boulders of the creek bed, using the terrain for cover, his twin Colts speaking with a measured, lethal rhythm. Each shot was aimed precise. He was no fancy gun shark, but a man who knew his weapons, a man fighting for his life and the life of his partner, a man fueled by a cold, righteous fury. Brule, hampered by his wounded leg, was a stationary target. Rip's next bullet struck the rock beside Brule's head, showering him with stone splinters. Brule flinched, his return shot hurried and high. Rip's answering slug caught the leaning L foreman in the chest, knocking him backward as if poleaxed. Brule's pistol clattered from his nerveless fingers. He lay still, his eyes wide and staring at the brightening sky, the red stain spreading across his shirt a final testament to the deadly accuracy of Rip's guns. Silence descended, broken only by Chavez's pained moans and the distant, startled cry of a hawk. Rip stood panting, the twin Colts still smoking in his hands. He scanned the canyon, every sense on high alert. 2 down, 1 crippled. But where was Gardner? As if summoned by the thought, a figure appeared on the rim of the canyon, silhouetted against the nascent dawn. Brock Gardner. He stood motionless for a long moment, taking in the scene below, Brule's still form, Chavez writhing in pain, Rip Campbell standing amidst the carnage, a figure of grim retribution. Gardner's face was unreadable from that distance, but Rip could feel the intensity of his gaze, the cold, reptilian focus of a man whose carefully laid plans had just been shattered. He had expected to preside over a triple execution. Instead, he found his enforcers dead or dying. Slowly, deliberately, Gardner began to descend into the canyon, his movements surprisingly agile for a man of his years. He didn't draw his ivory-handled Colt, not yet. He walked like a man approaching a business negotiation, albeit one that had gone sour. Rip waited, his gun still ready, his eyes never leaving the leaning L-boss. This was the architect of it all, the man who had framed Roy, who had ordered Simpson's death, who had orchestrated this entire bloody affair. Gardner stopped a dozen paces from Rip, his expression now a mask of cold fury. The early morning light cast his features in sharp relief, carving deep lines of bitterness and thwarted ambition around his mouth and eyes. "You," Gardner said, his voice low and venomous, "have cost me a great deal, Campbell. More than just men." "It's over, Gardner," Rip said, his voice flat and hard. "Your game is finished." A humorless smile touched Gardner's lips. "Is it? I still hold a card or two." His hand drifted, almost casually, towards the Colt at his hip. "Your partner, Stover, is still in my custody, or soon will be when my other men arrive at the jail. And you, my friend, look to be about at the end of your rope." It was the final play, the last desperate move of a cornered tyrant. Gardner's hand flashed towards his gun. But Rip had been waiting for it, expecting it. He had seen the flicker in Gardner's eyes, the coiling tension in his shoulders. Frontier justice, raw and unforgiving, was often a matter of split seconds, of instinct honed by a harsh land. Rip's own Colts, already in his hands, seemed to leap of their own accord. They roared as one, the sound deafening in the confines of the creek bed. Brock Gardner jerked backward as if hit by an invisible fist, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. His ivory-handled Colt, half drawn, clattered to the ground. He took 2 stumbling steps, then collapsed, his body hitting the earth with a sickening thud. He lay still, the dust slowly settling around him. The reign of Brock Gardner was over. Rip Campbell stood over him, the smoke from his pistols curling upwards in the still morning air. Justice, swift and terrible, had been served in the dry fork of Bitter Creek. He lowered his guns, a profound weariness settling over him. Gardner was dead, his leaning L enforcers neutralized. But Roy was still in peril, and the truth still needed to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light of day. He looked towards the moaning figure of Chavez, the crippled gunman, and a new thought began to form. Chapter 13. The acrid pall of gunsmoke hung heavy in the cool dawn air of Bitter Creek Canyon, mingling with the metallic tang of fresh blood. Brock Gardner lay still in the dust, his reign of terror ended by Rip Campbell's swift justice. Mort Brule was a lifeless heap further up the slope. Only Chavez, the wiry-leaning L rider, remained among Rip's immediate adversaries, his pained moans a stark reminder that the killing, at least for the moment, was done. Rip stood for a long moment, the twin Colts still warm in his hands, his chest heaving as the battle adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the throbbing agony of his own injuries. His head still felt like it might split open from Duffy's treacherous blow, and his body ached from the fight and the earlier abuse. But Roy Stover was still facing a lynch mob in San Carlos, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads. The fight here was won, but the war for Roy's freedom and his good name was far from over. He reloaded his peacemakers with a grim efficiency, his eyes scanning the silent, blood-soaked stage of their recent conflict. Jago, the hulking guard, lay dead near where he'd fallen, his neck broken by the plunge with Duffy. As for the ex-sheriff himself, Rip hadn't seen or heard a sign of him since the initial tumble. His gaze settled on Chavez. The man was propped against a boulder, clutching his shattered shoulder, his face gray with pain and the shock of his wounds. His eyes, when they met Rip's, were wide with fear, like those of a trapped animal. Rip walked towards him, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. "It's over, Chavez," Rip said, his voice low and hard, devoid of triumph. "Gardner's dead. Brule too. There's no one left to protect you, no one left to lie for." Chavez coughed, a raw, wet sound, and winced. "Don't kill me, Campbell," he gasped, his words barely audible. "Por favor. I got a family down Nogala's way." "Whether you live or die right now depends on you," Rip stated, his expression unyielding. "I want the truth. All of it. About Cal Blount's murder, and why Roy Stover was handed the blame." He knelt, bringing his face closer to the wounded gunman's. "Your boss is gone. His power is broken. Your loyalty to him means nothing now but a heavier stone to drag you to perdition. Tell me the truth, Chavez. It's the only coin you have left that might buy you anything." The man's dark eyes darted around, perhaps seeking an escape that didn't exist, or a reprieve that wouldn't come. He licked his dry, cracked lips. The rising sun was beginning to spill light into the canyon, painting the scene in stark, unforgiving detail. The bodies, the blood, the desperation etched on Chavez's face. "Gardner, heal his men," Chavez began, then trailed off, the ingrained fear of his dead master still potent. "Gardner's men will scatter like quail once they know he's dead and Brule with him," Rip countered, his voice implacable. "They were loyal to his coin and his power, not his memory. You owe him nothing now. But Roy Stover, an innocent man, is about to hang for a crime Gardner committed. You can stop that. You can speak one true word in your life." Chavez sagged, a tremor running through his wounded body. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a weary resignation. He looked at Rip, a flicker of something unreadable in his pain-filled eyes, fear perhaps, or a dawning understanding of his own mortality. "All right, Campbell, all right," he whispered, his breath hitching. "I'll tell ya. Ain't no reason to keep Gardner's secrets now, is there? Not when he's worm food." Rip waited, listening with an intensity that shut out the pain of his own wounds. "It was Gardner," Chavez said, his voice gaining a slight reedy strength as the words began to flow. "He killed Blunt. I was there. Me, Brule, and Tustin, the real Tustin, not Carp who you shot back in the other canyon, but his cousin Jess Tustin, another of Gardner's hard cases." So there was another Tustin, Rip thought, filing the information away. This clarified a point of confusion, but mattered little now. We tracked Blunt from Simpson's ranch, the 8x8, Chavez continued, his gaze distant, reliving the scene. Gardner wanted something Blunt was carrying. More than just the cattle money. "Papers," Gardner said. "Maps or claims, something about some hidden gold." This was new. Simpson had suspected Blunt carried more than just cash, but this was the first Rip had heard of gold claims. It added another layer of greed and ruthlessness to Gardner's character. "We cornered Blunt in a little draw about 10 miles out of San Carlos. He didn't have a chance. Gardner, he accused Blunt of trying to swindle him on a land deal, some old pretext. Blunt denied it, of course. They argued. Then Gardner, he just pulled his gun and shot him. Cold. No warning. Chavez shuddered, the memory clearly vivid. Blunt went down, never even cleared leather. And Roy Stover? Rip pressed, keeping his voice even. That was Brule's idea mostly, after Gardner cooled off a bit. Stover had ridden into the territory a few days before, asking around, looking for opportunities. An outsider, no connections. Perfect. Gardner liked it. Made it look like a robbery gone wrong. Jess Tustin and 2 drifters Brule paid off, they were the witnesses. Swore they saw Stover do it. Easy as that. Chavez coughed again, a racking spasm that brought a fresh sheen of sweat to his forehead. Where's this Jess Tustin now? Rip asked. Skipped out, Chavez rasped. Gardner sent him south, towards Mexico, right after the trial. Paid him well to disappear. So, one of the false witnesses was beyond reach for now. But Chavez's testimony, if it could be believed, if it could be used, was damning. Gardner figured, with Stover hanged, and Blount's papers in his pocket, he'd be clear, Chavez whispered, his strength failing. His eyelids began to flutter. He always had a plan. The confession hung in the air, stark and brutal. It painted a clear picture of Gardner's cold-blooded murder, the calculated framing of an innocent man, all for greed and power. Roy's name, at least in the ears of one man who had fought for him, was cleared. Chavez's breathing grew shallow, his eyes losing focus. Is it enough, Campbell? He murmured, a strange, almost pleading note in his voice. Will it count for anything? Before Rip could answer, a low groan emanated from the pile of rocks and debris where Jago and Sheriff Duffy had fallen. Rip spun, his gun instinctively coming up, his senses still on a knife's edge. He'd assumed both men were dead, or too gravely injured to be a threat. But now a figure was stirring, pushing aside a heavy stone. Tom Duffy, his face bloody and caked with dust, his clothes torn, slowly, painfully, levered himself into a sitting position. His leg was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle, but he was alive. And his eyes, wide and filled with a mixture of pain, shock, and something akin to horrified clarity, were fixed on Chavez. He had heard it. He had heard it all. Chavez gave one last, shuddering sigh, his head lolling to the side. His eyes stared blankly at the canyon wall. Whether his confession would count for anything in the hereafter, Rip couldn't say. But for Roy Stover, it might mean everything. Rip lowered his Colt, his gaze shifting from the dead gunman to the battered, broken form of ex-sheriff Tom Duffy. The man who had treacherously struck him down, the man who had been Gardner's willing pawn, was now the only other living soul who had heard Chavez's dying words. Duffy looked up at Rip, a dazed, almost uncomprehending expression on his face. "Sheriff," Rip said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of command. "You heard him. You heard it all, didn't you?" Chapter 14. "Sheriff?" Rip Campbell's voice, though quiet, cut through the dazed fog enveloping Tom Duffy's pain-racked consciousness. "You heard him. You heard it all, didn't you?" Duffy groaned, pushing a trembling hand against his broken leg, the bone grating with an agony that momentarily eclipsed the horror of what he'd witnessed. He looked up at Rip, who stood over him like some avenging angel of the trail, twin Colts still bearing the grim testament of recent battle. Beyond Rip, the lifeless forms of Brock Gardner, Mort Brule, and now Chavez, lay sprawled in the blood-soaked dust of Bitter Creek Canyon. The rising sun cast long, accusing shadows. I heard him," Duffy stammered, his voice raspy and broken. The words Chavez had gasped out, Gardner's cold-blooded murder of Cal Blunt, the cynical frame-up of Roy Stover, the mention of hidden gold, replayed in his mind with sickening clarity. He had been a pawn, a corrupt, self-serving fool dancing to Gardner's tune, and Gardner had intended for him to die alongside the rest, a loose end snipped clean. The betrayal was a bitter acid in his throat. Gardner, he shot blunt. Framed Stover. My God, Campbell, he was going to kill us all. Stover's still set to hang for it, Duffy, Rip said, his tone like flint. That lynch mob back in San Carlos isn't going to wait for a neatly written report. Chavez is dead. You and I are the only ones who heard that confession. The only ones who can tell the true story. Duffy stared at Rip, a wild, hunted look in his eyes. Tell them. They'll string me up alongside Stover if they find out the part one played. I was Gardner's man, through and through. They'll tear me apart. They might, Rip conceded, his gaze unyielding. Or they might see a man trying to undo a terrible wrong. A man who finally found enough grit to speak the truth, even if it was at the 11th hour with a noose practically around his own neck. He gestured with one of his Colts towards the carnage. Gardner can't hurt you anymore. His leaning L riders will scatter. But that mob in San Carlos, they're a different kind of animal. Roy Stover is an innocent man. He deserves to live. You help me save him, Duffy. You stand up and tell them what Chavez said, what you know to be the truth about Gardner's schemes, about your own part in it. And maybe, just maybe, there's a slim chance for you to salvage something from the wreckage of your life. Or you can stay here and wait for Gardner's remaining wolves to find you, or for your leg to fester and kill you slow. Your choice. Duffy looked around the silent, death-strewn canyon. The sun, climbing higher, was beginning to bake the rocks, and the buzz of early flies was a grim portent. He thought of Gardner's cold eyes as he'd pronounced the triple death sentence. He thought of the lynch mob, their faces contorted with fury. Then he thought of Roy Stover, a young man he'd helped railroad, facing death for a crime he hadn't committed. A tremor went through him, a complex cocktail of fear, self-preservation, and a nascent, unfamiliar stirring that might have been shame. All right, Campbell, he finally croaked, his voice hoarse with pain and emotion. All right. I'll do it. I'll tell them. Everything. For what it's worth now. He met Rip's gaze, a spark of desperate resolve flickering in his bloodshot eyes. I was blind, Campbell. A damn greedy fool. If there's a chance to make amends, I'll take it. Rip nodded curtly. There was no trust in the gesture, not yet, but a recognition of a necessary, if distasteful, alliance. We need to get you on a horse. And we need to ride like the devil himself is on our heels. Sunrise is here. That mob won't wait for a leisurely breakfast. The next hour was a blur of agonizing effort. Rip, his own wounds protesting, managed to catch his bay buck and one of the leaning L horses, a rangy sorrel that had belonged to Brule. Getting Duffy, with his shattered leg, onto the sorrel was a monumental task. The ex-sheriff, despite his newfound resolve, screamed in agony as Rip, with grim determination, fashioned a crude splint from a rifle stock and strips of saddle leather, then hoisted him into the saddle, lashing his injured leg to the stirrup to keep it immobile. Every movement sent jolts of fire through Duffy's body, but he bit back his cries, his face a pale, sweat-slicked mask. Rip, his head pounding, his muscles screaming, ignored his own discomfort, driven by the image of Roy Stover and the dwindling minutes. Finally, they were ready. Two battered, bloodied men, one a driven avenger, the other a broken, tentatively repentant lawman, setting out on a desperate race against time. San Carlos, Rip said, swinging onto Buck's back. And pray we're not too late. The ride was a special kind of hell. The Arizona sun climbed mercilessly, beating down on the riders, reflecting off the stark, rocky terrain. Every jarring step of the horses was a fresh torment for Duffy, who swayed in the saddle, his teeth clenched, fighting unconsciousness. Rip pushed them hard, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, urging the horses to a pace that was punishing for both animals and riders. They spoke little. The urgency of their mission hung heavy between them, a silent, shared burden. Rip occasionally glanced at Duffy, assessing his condition, seeing the man's resolve flicker but not extinguish under the wave of excruciating pain. For a man who had lived a life of bluster and corruption, Duffy was showing an unexpected, if desperate, fortitude. Perhaps, Rip thought, there was a core of something salvageable buried deep beneath the layers of greed and cowardice. Or perhaps it was merely the terror of the alternative. As they drew closer to San Carlos, the tension ratcheted higher. The faint sounds of the town began to carry on the wind, not the usual bustle of a frontier settlement, but something more ominous, a discordant hum of agitated voices, punctuated by sporadic angry shouts. Rip reined in Buck, on the crest of a low rise that overlooked the town. Duffy's horse drew up beside him, the ex-sheriff leaning heavily against the saddle horn, his face a deathly white. Below them, San Carlos was a scene of barely suppressed chaos. A large crowd, a veritable sea of angry faces, swirled around the squat stone jailhouse. Torches, though paling in the growing daylight, still burned, casting a lurid, smoky haze over the scene. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a raw, ugly energy. The sounds of the mob, a furious baying chorus, hit them like a physical blow. Stover. Bring out Stover. Justice for Cal Blunt. The words were a savage roar, the collective voice of a beast about to tear its prey apart. They could see men with ropes, others brandishing firearms, their faces contorted with a lust for vengeance. Duffy swayed, his eyes wide with a renewed terror. We're too late, Campbell, he gasped. They're ready to tear the place down. Rip's jaw tightened, his knuckles white on the reins. His gaze was fixed on the jail, a tiny island in a raging sea of mob fury. He could almost feel Roy's despair, his defiance, trapped within those stone walls. Not yet, Duffy, he said, his voice a low growl. Not while I can still draw breath. He nudged Buck forward, down the slope, towards the maelstrom. Let's go give them a truth they weren't expecting. Chapter 15. Hold you men. In the name of the law, I command you to disperse. Tom Duffy's voice, raw with pain, and a newfound desperate authority, cracked like a bullwhip over the new furious clamor of the lynch mob. He swayed precariously in his saddle, his splinted leg a fiery torment, but his eyes, bloodshot and wild, blazed with a desperate resolve. Rip Campbell, riding stirrup to stirrup with him, his face a grim mask of hardened determination, scanned the sea of enraged faces. They were a human tidal wave, surging against the very foundations of the San Carlos jail, their voices a guttural roar for Roy Stover's blood. Gardner might be dead, his chief lieutenant silenced, but the poison he'd spread had taken deep root in the town's fear and anger. The mob's momentum faltered for a heartbeat at the sight of their sheriff, battered, broken, but undeniably present, and accompanied by a grim-faced stranger who radiated an aura of deadly competence. Whispers rippled through the crowd. It's Duffy. What happened to him? Who's that with him? A burly miner, his face flushed with whiskey and indignation, pushed to the forefront, a length of rope coiled in his hand. Duffy. You gone soft. We're here for justice. For Cal Blunt. Hand over the killer Stover, or we'll take him ourselves. A chorus of affirmation rose from the mob. Several leaning L riders, still lingering on the fringes, began to agitate, their voices sharp and venomous, trying to whip the crowd's fury back to a fever pitch. There's been a mistake, Duffy shouted, his voice straining to carry over the tumult. New evidence. Stover, he might be innocent. Brock Gardner was the real killer. I heard the confession myself. A wave of disbelief, then outrage, swept through the crowd. Gardner? He's lying. Gardner wouldn't. The name of the powerful rancher, spoken as a murderer by their own sheriff, was a bombshell. Rip knew they had only moments before the mob's confusion turned back into focused violence. "The door, Duffy," he barked, nudging Buck forward. "We need to get inside. Now." They pushed their horses through the hesitant, parting ranks of the crowd, a few men yelling imprecations, others staring in stunned silence. They reached the heavy oak door of the jail just as Toby, the ferret-faced deputy, peered out, his eyes wide with alarm. "Sheriff." What's going on?" Toby stammered, his shotgun wavering. "Open this door, Toby." "That's an order," Duffy commanded, his old arrogance flaring, now fueled by a desperate urgency. "There's hell to pay, and we're short on time." Toby, bewildered by his superior's battered appearance and the armed stranger beside him, fumbled with the bolts and chains. With a groan of protesting metal, the jailhouse door swung inward. Rip was through it in an instant, Duffy half falling from his horse into Rip's arms, then propped against the doorjamb. The air inside the jail was cool and dim, smelling of stale sweat, fear, and unslaked justice. It was a small, grim space, a tiny office area, and beyond it, a short corridor lined with 2 cells. "Stover." "Which cell?" Rip demanded of Toby, who was gaping at Duffy's mangled leg. The one on the left, Campbell." "I mean, stranger." Toby stammered, clearly unnerved by Rip's intensity. Rip strode down the corridor. The first cell was empty. The second, at the very end, was occupied. A figure lay on the narrow cot, unmoving. For a terrible second, Rip's heart seized, fearing the worst. Then the figure stirred, slowly sitting up. Sunlight, lancing through the small barred window high in the cell wall, caught glints of fiery red in his disheveled hair. He was thinner than Rip remembered, his face drawn and pale beneath a stubborn beard growth, his clothes ragged. But the eyes that fixed on Rip were alive, burning with an unquenched, defiant spirit. "Roy Stover." A slow grin, a flash of white teeth in the grimy face, spread across Roy's features as he recognized the tall, gaunt figure standing before his cell. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," Roy said, his voice raspy from disuse but laced with its old familiar irony. "Look what the cat dragged in. Figured you for buzzard bait by now, Rip. Or did you just get tired of my winnin' poker hands and decide to track me down for a rematch?" Despite the grim circumstances, despite the pain and exhaustion, a wave of profound relief washed over Rip. It was Roy, his partner, his friend, still unbroken, still spitting fire even in the shadow of the gallows. The bond between them, forged on countless dusty trails, through shared dangers and lean times, was a palpable thing in the dim confines of the jail. "Took you long enough to find this particular saloon, partner," Rip said, his own voice rougher than he intended. He moved closer to the bars, his gaze taking in Roy's condition. "They been treating you hospitable?" Roy snorted, swinging his legs off the cot. He moved with a stiffness that spoke of weeks of confinement, but there was no hint of surrender in his posture. "Oh, the accommodations are prime if you don't mind the bars and the company of rats. And the local choir practice outside has been enthusiastic." He jerked his chin towards the window, from which the angry roar of the mob still filtered. "Heard they're planning a necktie social in my honor." "Gardner planned it," Rip corrected grimly. "But his plans have changed. He's dead, Roy. So is Brule. And Chavez, one of his gunmen, sang a song before he cashed in his chips. Confessed Gardner killed Cal Blunt and framed you for it." Roy's eyes widened, the defiant humor momentarily replaced by a stunned disbelief. "Gardner? Dead? And a confession?" He pushed himself up, gripping the bars, his knuckles white. You ain't just whistlin' Dixie, are you, Rip?" "No Dixie," Rip assured him. Duffy heard it too. "He's outside, broken leg and all, trying to remember what it feels like to be a lawman instead of a lapdog." He nodded towards the office. "But that mob out there doesn't know the story yet. And they're not in a listening mood." Roy looked past Rip, down the corridor, then back at his partner, a fierce, unwavering loyalty blazing in his eyes. "So what's the play, Rip? Seems like we're still sitting in on a high-stakes game with a bad hand." "We get you out of this cell first," Rip said, already examining the lock. "Then we figure out how to tell our story to a crowd that would rather see a hanging." Toby, who had followed Rip down the corridor, still looking dazed, held up a ring of keys. This might be the one, Sheriff. I mean, Mr. Campbell." His hand trembled as he offered them. Just as Rip reached for the keys, a renewed wave of sound crashed against the jail from outside, a rhythmic heavy thudding, interspersed with splintering wood and triumphant yells. The mob was no longer content to wait. They were attacking the jailhouse door itself. Roy gripped the bars tighter. "Sounds like the welcoming committee is getting impatient, partner." Chapter 16. The heavy oak door of the San Carlos jail groaned and shuddered under a fresh onslaught, the rhythmic thudding of some improvised battering ram, punctuated by the splintering of wood and the triumphant savage yells of the mob outside. Dust sifted from the ceiling beams, dancing in the pale shafts of morning light that pierced the grimy windows. "They ain't wastin' any time," Roy Stover yelled, his voice tight but steady as he rattled the bars of his cell. He'd been on his feet the instant the assault on the door began, his earlier ironic humor replaced by the keen alertness of a man facing imminent, violent death. "Rip, these keys Toby offered, which one is it?" Rip Campbell snatched the ring of keys from the trembling deputy's hand. Toby, his face the color of old parchment, looked ready to bolt. "Steady, Toby," Rip ordered, his voice a low growl that brooked no argument. "You're safer in here with us for now than out there with them. Find something to brace that door with, what's left of it. And keep that shotgun handy." He turned to Roy's cell, his hands surprisingly steady as he sorted through the keys. Outside, the voices rose in a hellish chorus, a symphony of bloodlust and misguided fury. "Hang Stover. Justice for Blunt. Don't let him cheat the rope." Mingled with the general outcry were sharper, more directed shouts. "Duffy's a liar. Gardner was murdered by these two," another voice screamed, followed by, "Don't let Campbell fool ya. He's a hired killer, come to spring his murdering partner." Rip's jaw tightened. Those were the remaining leaning L riders, he figured, leaderless now but still venomous, trying to ensure the mob completed Gardner's work. They were attempting to discredit Duffy and him before the truth could gain any traction, twisting the narrative to paint themselves as victims and Roy as the undeniable villain. Tom Duffy, propped near the front window, his broken leg rendering him largely immobile, peered out cautiously. "It's bedlam out there, Campbell," he reported, his voice hoarse. "They've got a log, maybe a dozen of them heaving it against the door. And I see a few of Gardner's men, fellow named Jed Applegate, another one, Pike, whipping 'em on. They're saying Gardner was a hero, and we're the outlaws." "Figures," Rip muttered, finally finding the right key. The lock on Roy's cell door gave a satisfying clunk. He swung the barred door open. "Come on out, partner. Looks like your necktie social is starting early." Roy Stover stepped free, stretching his long cramped limbs. He was gaunt from weeks of poor food and confinement, but his eyes blazed with a fierce, untamed light. He rolled his shoulders, looking around the small jail office as if sizing up a new corral. "Any spare hardware in this establishment, Rip? My trigger fingers feeling a mite lonely." "Toby," Rip called. "Extra weapons?" The deputy, who had managed to drag a heavy wooden crate against the splintering main door, looked up, startled. "Ah, yes, sir." Sheriff Duffy's spare Remington shotgun behind his desk, and an old Star revolver in the drawer. Not much ammunition for the Star, though. "The Remington will do fine for now," Roy said, already moving towards the desk. He picked up the shotgun, checking its load with an expert's touch. The feel of the weapon in his hands seemed to breathe new life into him, his shoulders straightening, a grim smile touching his lips. Been a while since I danced with one of these. The thudding against the door intensified, followed by a sharp crack as a hinge gave way with a screech of tortured metal. The door sagged inwards at the top, held precariously by the remaining hinge and Toby's crate. "They're coming through," Toby shrieked, backing away, his own shotgun now trembling in his grip. "Hold your ground, Toby," Rip commanded, moving to stand beside Roy near the corridor entrance, creating a clear field of fire towards the failing main door. He held his twin Colts ready. "Duffy, keep an eye on that window. Sing out if they try coming through there." "They won't take us without a fight, Campbell," Duffy called back, a surprising note of defiance in his voice. He dragged himself to where he could brace his back against the wall, his own service revolver in his hand, despite the agony it clearly cost him to move. The big sheriff, who had groveled before Gardner and had been ready to sacrifice an innocent man to save his own hide, was finally, it seemed, finding some sliver of the courage his badge demanded. Or perhaps it was just the terror of what the mob would do to him if they got their hands on him now. The voices outside were a maddening, terrifying cacophony. "Break it down. Get the rope. No mercy for killers." The leaning L agitators were doing their work well, stoking the flames of hatred, ensuring that no voice of reason could penetrate the collective madness. Each impact on the door sent fresh waves of dust and splinters into the small office. The hellish shadows cast by the few remaining torches outside, combined with the harsh, slanting rays of the early morning sun, created a disorienting, nightmarish tableau through the growing gaps in the door. "How many you figure out there, Rip?" Roy asked, his voice calm despite the chaos. The Remington held steady. "Too many to count," Rip replied grimly. "And at least a handful who know how to use their guns, thanks to Gardner's payroll." He spared a glance for his partner. "You ready for this, Roy?" Roy met his gaze, a grin that was all grit and no humor flashing across his face. "Been ready since they threw me in this hole, partner. Just waiting for the music to start." A section of the main door suddenly burst inward with a violent crash, wood splinters flying like shrapnel. Through the jagged opening, Rip saw a tangle of furious faces, contorted with hate, their eyes gleaming with bloodlust. The raw, primal sound of the mob, now inches away, was deafening. Jed Applegate, a raw-boned, leaning L rider with a face like a clenched fist, was at the forefront, a heavy axe in his hands, preparing to strike at the remaining timbers. "He's ours now, Duffy," Applegate roared, his voice thick with malice. "And so are you, you double-crossing." Before he could finish, Duffy's revolver barked from the window, the shot aimed not to kill but to warn, or perhaps to vent his own desperate fury. The bullet slammed into the doorframe near Applegate's head, showering him with splinters. The leaning L man recoiled for a split second, his eyes blazing. "They're firing on us," someone in the mob shrieked, a new note of fear mixing with their anger. "Get 'em. Get 'em all." The brief hesitation was over. With a renewed, desperate surge, the mob heaved against the failing door. The last hinge tore loose with a scream of metal, and the heavy oak panel crashed inwards, falling flat onto the office floor with a thunderous boom, kicking up a cloud of choking dust. Chapter 17. "Hold him at the door, Roy." Rip Campbell's voice cut like a lash through the deafening roar as the first wave of the lynch mob surged through the ruined doorway of the San Carlos jail, their faces contorted into masks of hate and bloodlust in the chaotic mixture of torchlight and harsh morning sun. "Don't let them get a foothold." Roy Stover, his red hair seeming to blaze in defiance, needed no urging. The Remington shotgun in his hands boomed, its heavy buckshot tearing into the front rank of attackers, sending them staggering back with howls of pain and surprise. The charge faltered for a precious instant. Toby, reload that scattergun and watch the windows." Rip yelled, his own twin Colts spitting fire, driving back a knot of men trying to flank them where the door had been. Splinters flew from the doorframe as bullets from the mob answered, whining through the small office. The air instantly grew thick with the acrid bite of gunpowder, the shouts of the attackers, and the pained grunts of the defenders. Tom Duffy, propped painfully against the wall near a side window, his broken leg a constant source of agony, raised his service revolver and fired towards the breached entrance. His shot was more a gesture of defiance than a well-aimed bullet, but it added to the cacophony and the momentary disarray of the attackers. "They're thick as flies out there, Campbell," he yelled, his voice hoarse. "And madder than hornets." The initial rush recoiled, leaving a couple of wounded men groaning in the dust just outside the threshold, but the sheer weight of numbers pressed behind them. Jed Applegate, the raw-boned leaning L rider, his face a mask of savage fury, was trying to rally them, his voice a gravelly roar. "Don't let 'em bluff you. There's only a handful of 'em. Rush 'em. Drag Stover out." It was in that brief, smoke-filled lull, as the mob hesitated before their next surge, that Duffy seized his chance. He dragged himself higher against the wall, his face pale and sweat-slicked, but his eyes burned with a strange new light, the desperate clarity of a man who had stared into the abyss and seen his own damnation. "Listen to me, you men of San Carlos," he bellowed, his voice cracking but carrying with surprising power over the receding din. "You're being fooled. Roy Stover is an innocent man." A fresh wave of angry shouts met his words. "Liar. Traitor. He's protecting his killer crony." Applegate's voice rose above them all. Duffy's turned tail. "He's Gardner's man no more, because Gardner's dead by their hands." Gardner's dead," Duffy roared back, silencing some of the mob with the sheer force of his conviction. "And he died, a murderer and a betrayer. I was there, in Bitter Creek. I heard Chavez, Gardner's own gunman, confess with his dying breath. Brock Gardner killed Cal Blunt in cold blood for his gold claims. Gardner framed Roy Stover to cover his own tracks. He would have killed me too, and Campbell here to silence us." A profound, uncertain silence fell over a portion of the crowd. Men looked at each other, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and dawning doubt. The name of Brock Gardner, a man who had wielded immense power and influence in the territory, being branded a common killer by their own sheriff, however compromised that sheriff might be, was a staggering revelation. "Chavez confessed," a voice called out from the throng, a miner whose face was more bewildered than angry now. "Is that true, Duffy?" "As God is my witness, it's true," Duffy cried, his voice ringing with a desperate sincerity. "Campbell heard it too. Stover never laid a hand on Blunt. You're aiming to lynch an innocent man, while the real villain lies dead by his own wicked deeds." The wildfire began to spread. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Gardner a killer? Gold claims. Duffy wouldn't dare lie about that, not now." The solid wall of mob certainty was fracturing, cracks of doubt appearing. Rip and Roy exchanged a quick glance. This was their chance. "Keep talking, Duffy," Rip urged. "Tell them everything." But the leaning L contingent, seeing their control over the mob slipping, reacted with renewed violence. "He's lying to save his own neck," Applegate screamed, pushing forward again, his rifle leveled. "Gardner was a good man. They're the murderers. Kill them all. Hang Stover first." A hard core of about a dozen men, mostly leaning L riders or their sympathizers, surged forward, determined to silence Duffy and seize Stover before the rest of the mob could be swayed. "Here they come, Rip," Roy yelled, the Remington barking again, its blast momentarily clearing the doorway. Rip's Colts answered, their deadly song a counterpoint to the heavier roar of the shotgun. He fought with a cold, deadly precision, picking his targets, trying to make every shot count. Beside him, Roy was a pillar of fiery defiance, working the shotgun with grim efficiency, his presence a bulwark against the tide. Even Toby, his earlier terror giving way to a desperate self-preservation, fired his own shotgun sporadically through a shattered windowpane, his shots wild but adding to the defense. The cramped jail office became a charnel house, filled with smoke so thick it was hard to breathe, the roar of gunfire deafening. Men fell, screaming, in the doorway. The leaning L riders, driven by a desperate loyalty to their fallen leader or fear of what would happen if the truth fully emerged, fought with a savage intensity. Through it all, Duffy, propped against the wall, continued to shout, his voice growing weaker but no less fervent. He recounted Chavez's words, adding details of Gardner's treachery, his own blindness, his own part in the frame-up. He laid bare his soul, his confession a raw, bleeding wound offered to the very people he had once lorded over. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the tide began to turn. Not among the die-hard leaning L men, but in the larger body of the mob. Men who had come for a lynching, fueled by grief and misinformation, began to lower their weapons. Faces that had been contorted with hate now showed confusion, then a dawning horror, as the possibility of their terrible mistake began to sink in. "Hold your fire, men," a stout blacksmith bellowed from the middle of the crowd, his voice carrying authority. "Let's hear the sheriff out. If what he says is true." "It is true," another man shouted. "I knew Cal Blunt. He mentioned some trouble with Gardner over mining rights just last week." Applegate, seeing his support dwindling, his face a mask of murderous rage, knew he was losing. If Duffy was allowed to continue, if the townspeople started to believe, the leaning L was finished in San Carlos. He raised his rifle, taking careful aim not at the fighting figures of Rip or Roy, but at the exposed, vulnerable form of Tom Duffy. "He's a lying dog," Applegate shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. "And dead dogs tell no tales. This will shut him up for good." His finger tightened on the trigger. Chapter 18. He's a lying dog. Jed Applegate's shriek cut through the tense, charged air, his rifle rock steady as he drew a bead on the exposed, pain-racked form of Tom Duffy. "And dead dogs tell no tales. This will shut him up for good." Before Applegate's finger could complete its murderous squeeze, before the leaning L man could silence the burgeoning truth, Rip Campbell moved. He didn't have time for a carefully aimed shot. He fired from the hip, one of his Colts bucking, the bullet whining past Applegate's head with a hornet's buzz, close enough to make the man flinch violently and spoil his aim. Applegate's rifle discharged, the shot going wild, thudding harmlessly into the adobe wall high above Duffy's head. But the intent was clear, starkly illuminated for every man in that suddenly silent crowd to see. Gardner's man had tried to murder the sheriff in cold blood to stop him from speaking. That single, desperate act of suppression was the spark that ignited a new kind of fire in the mob. The bloodlust, so recently directed at Roy Stover, now found a new, more deserving target. He tried to kill him. A woman screamed from the edge of the crowd, her voice shrill with outrage. Duffy was telling the truth, and Applegate tried to shoot him down. The stout blacksmith who had earlier called for Duffy to be heard now bellowed, his voice like the clang of his own hammer on steel. "They're silencing him. Gardner's men. They don't want us to hear it." He took a step forward, his massive fists clenched. "Are we going to let these leaning L coyotes tell us who to hang and who to listen to?" A low growl, entirely different in character from their earlier fury, began to emanate from the assembled townspeople. It was the sound of a community waking from a fever dream, realizing with dawning horror how close they had come to committing a monstrous injustice. The truth that Duffy was painfully, haltingly revealing, the story of Chavez's deathbed confession, of Gardner's villainy, and Roy Stover's innocence was beginning to resonate with an undeniable power. Applegate, seeing the tide turn against him with terrifying speed, snarled, "He's a liar. All of 'em. Gardner was a good man." He swung his rifle towards Rip, but he was too slow. Several townsmen, their faces grim with a new resolve, surged forward. One, a wiry teamster, tackled Applegate around the knees, sending him sprawling in the dust. The rifle flew from his grasp. Other citizens grabbed at the remaining handful of leaning L riders, who suddenly found themselves isolated, surrounded by a sea of accusing, angry faces. "Hold on there, Pike," the blacksmith roared, grabbing another of Gardner's men by the scruff of his neck. "Your boss ain't around to protect you now. Maybe you got some confessin' of your own to do." The fight, which moments before had been the desperate stand of 4 men against a lynch mob, now transformed. It became a chaotic, swirling melee as the citizens of San Carlos, their eyes opened, turned on the remnants of Gardner's gang. Rip and Roy, startled by the sudden shift, found themselves with unexpected allies. They held their fire, watching as the townsfolk themselves began to mete out a rough, spontaneous justice to the men who had manipulated and deceived them. The leaning L riders, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, fought briefly, desperately, but they were no match for the righteous fury of aroused citizenry. One by one, they were disarmed, subdued, and dragged away, their protests and denials lost in the angry shouts of the crowd. Through the settling dust and the receding clamor, Tom Duffy, still propped against the jail wall, his face pale but resolute, continued his story. His voice, though weaker now, carried in the relative quiet, each word falling like a stone into a pool of dawning understanding. He recounted Chavez's fear, the details of Blount's murder, the cold calculation of Gardner's frame-up, his own shameful complicity, and finally, Gardner's intent to execute them all to ensure no trace of his crimes remained. He would have killed me like a dog," Duffy finished, his voice thick with exhaustion and a profound, weary shame. "Just like he was about to have young Stover killed. For gold. For power. He fooled us all." Silence, deep and profound, settled over the crowd. The sun, now fully risen, bathed the scene in its clear, impartial light, illuminating the battered jailhouse, the exhausted defenders, and the faces of the townsfolk, faces that now reflected not bloodlust, but a mixture of shock, guilt, and a dawning respect for the battered men who had held the line. The blacksmith, his anger replaced by a grim solemnity, stepped forward. "Sheriff," he said, his voice rough but no longer hostile, addressing Duffy with a grudging deference. "If what you say is true, and by the looks of how Gardner's men tried to shut you up, I reckon it is, then this town owes Roy Stover more than just his life. It owes him an apology." Another man, a storekeeper Rip had noticed earlier for his loud denunciations of Stover, now looked shamefaced. We were wrong. Led astray by lies and our own hotheads." He looked towards the jail. "Stover, he's innocent." The cry was picked up by others, a murmur at first, then growing stronger, a chant of dawning truth. "Stover is innocent. Gardner was the killer. Free Stover." The bloodlust was broken. The real story of Cal Blount's death, pieced together from a dying gunman's confession and relayed by a fallen lawman seeking a sliver of redemption, had finally emerged. The truth, however hard-won, was beginning to out. Rip watched the transformation of the crowd, a measure of relief easing the coiled tension within him. He glanced at Roy, who stood beside him, the Remington shotgun now resting easier in his grip, a look of weary disbelief on his face. The blacksmith, followed by a group of other prominent townsmen, moved towards the shattered entrance of the jail. He paused, looking at Rip, then at Roy. "Mr. Campbell," he said, his voice carrying a new respect. "You and your partner, you stood against us all. You fought for the truth when we were blind to it." He then turned his gaze fully towards Roy Stover, who still stood just inside the dim interior of the jail, a figure of resilience. "Mr. Stover," the blacksmith called out, his voice clear and carrying across the now subdued crowd. "The door's open. You can come on out. There's no one here who'll harm you now." Chapter 19. Mr. Stover, the blacksmith's voice, now stripped of its earlier menace and imbued with a rough, honest humility, echoed into the dim, smoke-filled interior of the jail. "The door's open. You can come on out. There's no one here who'll harm you now." Roy Stover stood for a long moment, the heavy Remington shotgun still cradled in his arms, his gaze fixed on the shattered doorway. Beyond it, he could see a sea of faces, no longer contorted with hate, but now reflecting a mixture of shame, weariness, and a dawning, hesitant respect. The roar of the lynch mob had died, replaced by an almost unnerving silence, broken only by the distant nicker of a horse and the low moans of the men injured in the fight. He took a deep breath, the first truly free breath he'd drawn in weeks, tinged though it was with the lingering scent of gunpowder and stale fear. Then, with a squaring of his shoulders that spoke of an indomitable spirit, he walked towards the light. As Roy stepped out into the full glare of the Arizona morning, a collective sigh seemed to emanate from the assembled townsfolk. He blinked against the sudden brightness, his eyes, accustomed to the gloom of his cell, taking a moment to adjust. He was a gaunt figure, his clothes hanging loose on his frame, his red hair matted with sweat and grime, but he stood tall, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with a calm, appraising look that held no fear, no malice, only a quiet, unyielding defiance that had seen him through the darkest hours. Rip Campbell was there, just outside the doorway, leaning tiredly against the bullet-scarred adobe wall, his twin Colts holstered, but his presence a silent promise of unwavering support. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance volumes were spoken, of perils faced, of loyalty tested, of a brotherhood forged in the crucible of shared danger, and proven as true and unyielding as tempered steel. "Figured you might enjoy some sunshine, partner," Rip said, his voice low, a hint of a rare smile touching the corners of his lips. "Beats staring at stone walls, I reckon." Roy's own lips quirked. "It does have a certain appeal," he admitted, his gaze lingering on the distant, sun-baked mesas that ringed the horizon. He took another deep draught of the clean desert air. Almost forgot what it felt like not to have a rope shadow in every sunrise. The blacksmith, his face etched with contrition, stepped forward, his dusty hat clutched in his big hands. Several other prominent citizens followed his lead, their expressions somber. "Mr. Stover," the blacksmith began, his voice gruff with emotion. "On behalf of the decent folk of San Carlos, though we acted little like it this day, I want to offer our deepest apologies. We were misled, blinded by grief and anger, and by the lies of evil men. We were wrong," the storekeeper who had earlier been so vocal in demanding Roy's death added, his own voice thick with shame. "We nearly committed a terrible injustice. If it weren't for your partner here, and Sheriff Duffy finally finding his conscience." He gestured towards where Tom Duffy lay, his broken leg now being crudely but carefully tended by a couple of the more level-headed townsmen, his face pale but set with a new, grim determination. Roy looked from the townsman to Rip, then back again. His gaze was steady, his expression thoughtful. "A man makes mistakes," he said finally, his voice even. "A whole town can make 'em too, I suppose, when fear and lies get the upper hand. The important thing is seeing the truth when it finally decides to show its face." He paused, then added, a flicker of his old fire returning to his eyes, "And I reckon the truth had some damn good help kicking down the door today." A low murmur of agreement went through the crowd. The tension that had gripped San Carlos for days, the dark cloud of suspicion and impending violence, was finally beginning to lift, replaced by a weary, chastened understanding. Rip pushed himself off the wall. "You'll get no argument from me on that, Roy." He walked over to his partner, and though there were no effusive gestures, no grand pronouncements, the quiet clasp of their hands, the look that passed between them, spoke of a bond that ran deeper than words. It was the understanding of men who had faced death side by side, who had trusted each other implicitly when all else failed. Their partnership, tested in the harshest fires, had indeed proven true as steel. "What now, Rip?" Roy asked, his voice dropping lower as the townsfolk began to disperse, some to tend the wounded, others to discuss in hushed tones the morning's dramatic events, their minds still reeling from the revelations. The captured Leaning L riders were being herded into the now vacant cells of the jail, their curses and threats ignored. "First," Rip said, his gaze practical, "we get you cleaned up. You look like something the coyotes dragged in and then thought better of." Despite the gravity of their situation, a ghost of a smile played on his lips. "Then some real food, a shave, and your own guns. That Remington served you well, but I know you're partial to your own iron." Roy grinned, a flash of his old irrepressible spirit. "You read my mind, partner. A bath wouldn't go amiss either. This jailhouse perfume ain't exactly what you'd call inviting." He looked around at the battered jail, the subdued town, the bodies of Gardner's men being carried away. "So Gardner's dead for certain?" "As certain as sunrise," Rip affirmed. His ambition finally outran his reach. He glanced towards Duffy, who, despite his pain, was giving a halting but firm account to a small group of serious-faced townsmen, recounting Chavez's confession, detailing Gardner's orders. The ex-sheriff was a broken man, physically and in reputation, but in his current state he was perhaps more honest than he'd ever been. "And the Leaning L?" Roy's question was quiet, but it hung in the air with a steely implication. Rip met his partner's gaze. The immediate danger was past. Roy was free, his name cleared in the eyes of San Carlos. But the source of the poison, the sprawling ranch that had served as Gardner's fortress and the wellspring of his corrupt power, still stood. The head of the snake had been cut off, but the body might still twitch with a dangerous life. "That," Rip said slowly, "is a conversation for after that bath and a square meal, partner." He clapped Roy on the shoulder, a rare gesture of affection that spoke volumes. "For now, let's just be grateful you're standing here in the sun instead of swinging from a cottonwood." Roy nodded, a deep, weary sigh escaping him. The full weight of his ordeal, the weeks of false imprisonment, the ever-present shadow of a hangman's noose, seemed to settle on him for a moment, then lift. He looked at Rip, his eyes clear and steady. "Good to be back in the world of the living, Rip." "Damn good." Together, the two partners, their bond reforged and strengthened in the crucible of betrayal and violence, turned their backs on the San Carlos jail. They walked out into the full light of the Arizona morning, two solitary figures against a vast, indifferent landscape, leaving behind them a town grappling with its conscience, but heading towards a future where other accounts still needed to be settled, and other trails undoubtedly awaited. The first order of business, however, was simple: a hot meal, strong coffee, and the familiar comfort of well-oiled steel in a trusted holster. Chapter 20. Mr. Stover, the blacksmith's voice, now stripped of its earlier menace and imbued with a rough, honest humility, echoed into the dim, smoke-filled interior of the jail. "The door's open. You can come on out. There's no one here who'll harm you now." Roy Stover stood for a long moment, the heavy Remington shotgun still cradled in his arms, his gaze fixed on the shattered doorway. Beyond it, he could see a sea of faces, no longer contorted with hate, but now reflecting a mixture of shame, weariness, and a dawning, hesitant respect. The roar of the lynch mob had died, replaced by an almost unnerving silence, broken only by the distant nicker of a horse and the low moans of the men injured in the fight. He took a deep breath, the first truly free breath he'd drawn in weeks, tinged though it was with the lingering scent of gunpowder and stale fear. Then, with a squaring of his shoulders that spoke of an indomitable spirit, he walked towards the light. As Roy stepped out into the full glare of the Arizona morning, A collective sigh seemed to emanate from the assembled townsfolk. He blinked against the sudden brightness, his eyes, accustomed to the gloom of his cell, taking a moment to adjust. He was a gaunt figure, his clothes hanging loose on his frame, his red hair matted with sweat and grime, but he stood tall, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with a calm, appraising look that held no fear, no malice, only a quiet, unyielding defiance that had seen him through the darkest hours. Rip Campbell was there, just outside the doorway, leaning tiredly against the bullet-scarred adobe wall, his twin Colts holstered, but his presence a silent promise of unwavering support. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance volumes were spoken, of perils faced, of loyalty tested, of a brotherhood forged in the crucible of shared danger, and proven as true and unyielding as tempered steel. "Figured you might enjoy some sunshine, partner," Rip said, his voice low, a hint of a rare smile touching the corners of his lips. "Beats staring at stone walls, I reckon." Roy's own lips quirked. "It does have a certain appeal," he admitted, his gaze lingering on the distant, sun-baked mesas that ringed the horizon. He took another deep draught of the clean desert air. Almost forgot what it felt like not to have a rope shadow in every sunrise. The blacksmith, his face etched with contrition, stepped forward, his dusty hat clutched in his big hands. Several other prominent citizens followed his lead, their expressions somber. "Mr. Stover," the blacksmith began, his voice gruff with emotion. "On behalf of the decent folk of San Carlos, though we acted little like it this day, I want to offer our deepest apologies. We were misled, blinded by grief and anger, and by the lies of evil men. We were wrong," the storekeeper who had earlier been so vocal in demanding Roy's death added, his own voice thick with shame. "We nearly committed a terrible injustice. If it weren't for your partner here, and Sheriff Duffy finally finding his conscience." He gestured towards where Tom Duffy lay, his broken leg now being crudely but carefully tended by a couple of the more level-headed townsmen, his face pale but set with a new, grim determination. Roy looked from the townsman to Rip, then back again. His gaze was steady, his expression thoughtful. "A man makes mistakes," he said finally, his voice even. "A whole town can make 'em too, I suppose, when fear and lies get the upper hand. The important thing is seeing the truth when it finally decides to show its face." He paused, then added, a flicker of his old fire returning to his eyes, "And I reckon the truth had some damn good help kicking down the door today." A low murmur of agreement went through the crowd. The tension that had gripped San Carlos for days, the dark cloud of suspicion and impending violence, was finally beginning to lift, replaced by a weary, chastened understanding. Rip pushed himself off the wall. "You'll get no argument from me on that, Roy." He walked over to his partner, and though there were no effusive gestures, no grand pronouncements, the quiet clasp of their hands, the look that passed between them, spoke of a bond that ran deeper than words. It was the understanding of men who had faced death side by side, who had trusted each other implicitly when all else failed. Their partnership, tested in the harshest fires, had indeed proven true as steel. "What now, Rip?" Roy asked, his voice dropping lower as the townsfolk began to disperse, some to tend the wounded, others to discuss in hushed tones the morning's dramatic events, their minds still reeling from the revelations. The captured Leaning L riders were being herded into the now vacant cells of the jail, their curses and threats ignored. "First," Rip said, his gaze practical, "we get you cleaned up. You look like something the coyotes dragged in and then thought better of." Despite the gravity of their situation, a ghost of a smile played on his lips. "Then some real food, a shave, and your own guns. That Remington served you well, but I know you're partial to your own iron." Roy grinned, a flash of his old irrepressible spirit. "You read my mind, partner. A bath wouldn't go amiss either. This jailhouse perfume ain't exactly what you'd call inviting." He looked around, at the battered jail, the subdued town, the bodies of Gardner's men being carried away. So Gardner's dead for certain. As certain as sunrise, Rip affirmed. His ambition finally outran his reach. He glanced towards Duffy, who, despite his pain, was giving a halting but firm account to a small group of serious-faced townsmen, recounting Chavez's confession, detailing Gardner's orders. The ex-sheriff was a broken man, physically and in reputation, but in his current state he was perhaps more honest than he'd ever been. And the leaning L? Roy's question was quiet, but it hung in the air with a steely implication. Rip met his partner's gaze. The immediate danger was past. Roy was free, his name cleared in the eyes of San Carlos. But the source of the poison, the sprawling ranch that had served as Gardner's fortress and the wellspring of his corrupt power, still stood. The head of the snake had been cut off, but the body might still twitch with a dangerous life. That, Rip said slowly, is a conversation for after that bath and a square meal, partner. He clapped Roy on the shoulder, a rare gesture of affection that spoke volumes. For now, let's just be grateful you're standing here in the sun instead of swinging from a cottonwood. Roy nodded, a deep, weary sigh escaping him. The full weight of his ordeal, the weeks of false imprisonment, the ever-present shadow of a hangman's noose, seemed to settle on him for a moment, then lift. He looked at Rip, his eyes clear and steady. Good to be back in the world of the living, Rip. Damn good. Chapter 21. Well, reckon that about ties a bow on the leaning L brand for good and all, Roy Stover said, wiping dust from his hands. He leaned against a corral post at the now subdued and sparsely populated leaning L ranch, surveying the scene. Several days had passed since Brock Gardner's downfall. True to the outline of Chapter 20, honest cowboys who'd worked for the outfit, unaware of the true depth of Gardner's villainy, had collected their pay, or what remained of it, and ridden off, wanting no part of the stench that now clung to the ranch's name. Herds of rustled cattle, bearing altered brands, were being painstakingly sorted under the watchful eyes of a committee of San Carlos stockmen, eager to see them returned to their rightful owners. The air, which had once crackled with Gardner's iron-fisted authority, now felt strangely hollow, echoing with the ghosts of his misdeeds. Rip Campbell, his gaze fixed on the distant purple-hazed mountains, nodded slowly. The local branches are trimmed, Roy. But a tree as rotten as Gardner's likely had roots running deeper and farther than San Carlos. The dust had settled, literally and figuratively, over the immediate chaos, but a persistent unease still tugged at him. Still got that itch, huh? Roy observed, pushing his hat back. Figured with Gardner planted, and his top wolves put down, you'd be looking towards a fresh trail where the air's cleaner. The air here still feels thick, Rip admitted. Simpson mentioned Gardner was after more than just Blount's poke for the 8x8 cattle. And Chavez, before he cashed in, spoke of papers, maps, something about hidden gold that Blunt was carrying. We found Gardner's strongbox in his office. Had a fair bit of coin, some deeds to local land, but nothing that screamed of a bigger operation, nothing about those gold claims. They had spent the better part of the previous day in Gardner's surprisingly opulent ranch office, sifting through his affairs. The main ledger showed cattle transactions, land purchases, payrolls, all seemingly above board on the surface, though Rip suspected a deeper, more cleverly concealed accounting existed somewhere. The leaning L, vast as it was, didn't seem grand enough to fuel the kind of power Gardner had wielded, nor the resources he'd commanded to corrupt lawmen and silence enemies so effectively. The cattle rustling, Rip was beginning to sense, had been a sideshow, a convenient local enterprise, but not the heart of the beast. Maybe he kept the real important stuff somewhere else, Roy suggested. Or on him. We didn't find much on his body, except his gun and a half-empty wallet. He was too smart for that, Rip mused. A man like Gardner, with secrets potent enough to kill for, would have a safer place. He thought of the ranch house itself, a sprawling adobe structure more fortress than home. They had searched it, but cursorily. Most of Gardner's personal effects were still there, untouched, as if awaiting his return. The few remaining skeleton crew ranch hands, thoroughly spooked, had kept to the bunkhouse, offering no resistance. There was that old roll-top desk in his private study, Rip said suddenly, a new thought striking him. The one with the jammed lower drawer. We figured it was just stuck from the dry air. Roy straightened up. Well now, a jammed drawer on a dead man's desk has a certain appeal to a curious mind, don't it? An hour later, they stood before the imposing mahogany desk in Gardner's dim, leather and tobacco-scented study. The room felt oppressive, heavy with the departed owner's ruthless ambition. Using a pry bar carefully salvaged from the stables, Rip worked on the stubborn lower drawer. It resisted, then with a groan of tortured wood, scraped open. It appeared empty at first glance, save for a layer of dust and a few stray tobacco shreds. Roy let out a disappointed sigh. Dry hole, partner. Rip, however, ran his fingers along the bottom of the drawer. His knuckles brushed against something that wasn't wood, a slight unevenness, a faint line. He pressed. A section of the drawer bottom, no bigger than a book, clicked softly and yielded. A false bottom. Beneath it lay not gold or currency, but a slim oilskin-wrapped packet and a small, tarnished tin box. With a shared glance of anticipation, Rip lifted out the packet. Inside, secured with a faded ribbon, were a dozen or so letters, written in various hands, some on expensive stationery, others on rougher paper. The postmarks were varied and illuminating: Santa Fe, Prescott, Denver, even as far as San Francisco. The names of the correspondents were unfamiliar, but the tone of the letters, guarded yet hinting at significant sums of money, clandestine meetings, and shipments of unspecified goods through hidden routes, spoke volumes. There were coded phrases, oblique references to territorial concessions, and influential friends in high places. "This ain't about cows, Rip," Roy breathed, peering over his shoulder, his voice hushed. "This is bigger. Way bigger." Rip nodded grimly. The letters painted a shadowy picture of a criminal enterprise that stretched far beyond the borders of Arizona territory, a network of corruption and illicit dealings that made the Leaning L's cattle rustling look like petty theft. Gardner hadn't just been a rancher, he'd been a linchpin in a widespread web of crime. The ghosts of the past were beginning to materialize, revealing the true scope of Gardner's ambition. Then Roy picked up the small tin box. It was heavier than it looked. He pried open the hinged lid. Nestled inside on a bed of faded velvet lay not papers, but a collection of oddly shaped, discolored stones, gold nuggets, rich and raw, alongside a few crudely smelted lumps of the precious metal. And beneath them, folded carefully, was a piece of brittle, yellowed parchment. Rip took the parchment, his fingers gentle as he unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map, rough but detailed, depicting a series of interlocking canyons in a remote, unnamed section of the Dragoon Mountains. Specific landmarks were noted: a balanced rock, a lightning-struck ponderosa, a natural arch. And in the heart of this maze, one particular spot was marked with a small, faded X and the crudely inked initials CB. "Cal Blunt," Rip said softly, the pieces falling into place with chilling clarity. This was what Gardner had killed him for. Not just the poke of 8 gold, but the knowledge contained on this map. The hidden gold claims. So the stories were true, Roy murmured, his eyes wide as he stared at the map. Blunt really did stumble onto a mother lode. He looked at Rip. And Gardner got his hands on the map after all. And it seems he was the only one who knew its precise location, or he wouldn't have needed to keep the map itself, Rip reasoned. Which means, Roy finished, a new dangerous light glinting in his eyes, that whatever gold is up there is still up there for the taking. He paused. And if Gardner had partners in that bigger web you were talking about, they might not know about this particular treasure. Or they might have a general idea, and with Gardner gone, they'll be looking to claim it. Rip carefully refolded the map. The dust had indeed settled over San Carlos, but it had revealed something far more complex and dangerous than they had imagined. Gardner's criminal empire, though its head was severed, still had a legacy. And now, they held the key to its most coveted secret. "Looks like our trail ain't quite ended yet, partner," Rip said, his voice quiet but resolute. He tapped the map. "This is a dangerous secret to hold. And if Gardner's other associates, these influential friends from his letters, get wind of it." Roy's grin was wolfish. "Then we'd best get to it before they do." He looked at the tin box with its raw gold. "Reckon we might need a new grub stake for this next adventure, Rip. And this here map points right to the bank." Chapter 22. "Then we'd best get to it before they do," Roy Stover had said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light as he stared at Cal Blount's crudely drawn map. The small tin box of raw gold nuggets found in Gardner's secret drawer was proof enough of the treasure's existence. "Reckon we might need a new grub stake for this next adventure, Rip. And this here map points right to the bank." Rip Campbell, however, saw more than just potential wealth in the faded ink on the brittle parchment. He saw the final, bloody period to the sentence that had begun with Cal Blount's murder and Roy's unjust imprisonment. "It's not just about the gold, Roy," he'd countered, his voice quiet but firm as they sat in Gardner's plundered office, the ghosts of the dead rancher's ambition heavy in the air. "Those letters we found. Gardner had partners, dangerous men scattered across the territory. If they get their hands on this gold, they'll just be funding more of the same corruption and violence that nearly got you hanged. Blunt died to protect this, or at least to profit from it himself. We owe it to him and to Simpson to see this through, to make sure Gardner's poison doesn't keep spreading." Roy nodded slowly, the initial gleam of treasure hunting in his eyes giving way to a more sober understanding. "You're right, partner. As always. This ain't just a payday. It's a reckoning. Gardner's surviving jackals shouldn't get to feast on what he stole, especially not what cost Blunt his life and nearly mine." And so, 2 days later, with fresh supplies, their colts well-oiled, and Blount's map carefully stowed in Rip's saddlebag, they rode east from San Carlos, leaving the chastened town and the slowly dismantling leaning El Empire behind them. Their destination was the remote, formidable Dragoon Mountains, a jagged spine of granite and volcanic rock that clawed at the Arizona sky, a place whispered to be haunted by Apache ghosts and lost Spanish mines. The journey itself was a testament to the harsh beauty and unforgiving nature of the land. They traversed sun-baked flats where the heat shimmered in visible waves, creating phantom lakes that danced and receded like broken promises. They threaded their way through narrow, winding canyons where the silence was broken only by the click of their horses' hooves on stone and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Each night, they made camp under a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed almost close enough to touch, the vastness of the desert night pressing in on them, a reminder of their isolation. Rip, with his methodical patience, took the lead in deciphering Blount's crude map, comparing its landmarks, a distinctive spearpoint butte, a trio of ancient wind-hollowed saguaros, a dry wash that split around a table-sized slab of red rock, to the actual terrain. Roy, with his keener eye for subtle shifts in the landscape, and an almost uncanny sense for finding water where none seemed to exist, proved an invaluable partner. On the third day, as they pushed deeper into the Dragoons, following a trail that was little more than a game path, Roy reined in his horse, his head cocked. "Hear that, Rip?" Rip listened. At first, nothing but the sigh of the wind through the sparse pinon and juniper. Then a faint, rhythmic chink, 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 the unmistakable sound of a pickaxe striking rock, carried on the breeze from somewhere further up the canyon they were entering. They exchanged a grim look. They were not alone. Gardner's allies? Roy mouthed, his hand instinctively dropping to the butt of his Colt. "Could be," Rip acknowledged quietly. or just some hopeful prospector. But Blunt marked this canyon. We proceed with caution. They dismounted, tethering their horses in a thicket of manzanita, and continued on foot, moving with the silence and caution of seasoned hunters. The canyon narrowed, its walls rising steeply, carved by eons of wind and water into fantastic shadowed shapes. The sound of the pickaxe grew louder, closer, echoing off the stone. Creeping to the edge of a rockfall that offered a screened view, Rip peered down into a small, sun-drenched bowl where the canyon temporarily widened. 3 men were at work near a freshly dug prospect hole at the base of a promising-looking quartz vein. Their horses were tethered nearby, their gear scattered. They were rough-looking men, heavily armed, with the hard, watchful eyes of those who lived on the raw edge of the frontier. None of them were familiar to Rip, but they had the unmistakable air of men who wouldn't take kindly to intruders. "Prospectors, right enough," Roy whispered beside him. "But they look like they'd slit your throat for a pinch of dust." "They're not at Blount's X," Rip observed, consulting the map mentally. "His mark is further up, in a side canyon off this main one. But they're close. Too close for comfort." They watched for a while longer. The men worked with a desperate energy, their movements fueled by the eternal lure of gold. There was a tension about them, a constant scanning of their surroundings that suggested they were either expecting trouble or ready to make it. If Gardner had partners, Rip mused, they wouldn't necessarily have a copy of Blount's map. But they might know the general area he was prospecting. These could be some of them, trying their luck. Or, Roy added, they could just be 3 hard hombres who'd jump any claim that showed color, no questions asked. They decided to bypass them, making a wide, arduous detour over a high, rocky saddle to avoid the main canyon floor. The effort cost them precious hours and taxed their horses, but the risk of a premature confrontation with unknown men was too great. Blount's secret had already cost too many lives. As dusk began to settle, casting long purple shadows across the rugged peaks, they finally found the side canyon indicated on the map. It was a narrow, almost hidden fissure in the rock, its entrance choked with a dense growth of thorny scrub. The lightning-struck ponderosa Blunt had marked stood like a blackened sentinel at its mouth. A palpable sense of anticipation, mixed with a primal unease, settled over Rip and Roy as they pushed their weary horses into the gloomy passage. This was it, the heart of Cal Blount's secret, the hidden gold that had driven Brock Gardner to murder and deceit. The canyon twisted and turned, each bend revealing more of the same stark, silent rock, the air growing cooler, heavier. The silence here was profound, almost sepulchral. Then Roy, riding point, let out a low whistle. "Rip?" "Tracks." Rip dismounted, joining his partner. There, in a patch of softer earth protected by an overhang, were hoof prints. Not their own. 2 horses, shod and recent. Very recent. They were headed deeper into the canyon, in the same direction Blount's map indicated. The race was on, and it seemed they were already behind. Friends of those prospectors? Roy wondered aloud, his voice tight. "Or the ones we were really worried about," Rip replied grimly. "Gardner's other wolves, come to claim their share of the kill." They pressed on, the last vestiges of daylight failing them, the moon a pale sliver in the inky sky. The map's final landmarks were harder to discern in the gloom, but Blunt had been thorough. "Past the balanced rock that looks like a skull," Rip read from memory. "Then seek the cave hidden behind the weeping face of the cliff where the sun never touches." They found the skull rock, its eerie silhouette stark against the stars. And then, further on, where the canyon wall wept a dark streak of moisture from some hidden seep, they saw it, a narrow, almost invisible opening, concealed by a thick curtain of desert ivy and shadow. Dismounting again, hearts pounding with a mixture of excitement and dread, they pushed aside the ivy. A dark, cool opening beckoned. Rip struck a match, its flame flaring briefly, illuminating the entrance to a shallow cave or mine adit. And just inside, plain as day in the flickering light, were fresh bootprints in the dust leading inwards. Someone was already here, or had been, mere hours, perhaps minutes before. Following the map's final cryptic clue, around a towering hoodoo that Blunt must have fancifully named the Weeping Face, the narrow canyon beyond the cave mouth opened into a small, hidden amphitheater of rock, bathed in the eerie silver of the rising moon. And there, tucked beneath an ancient weathered cliff dwelling that clung precariously to the canyon wall, was a freshly disturbed pile of rocks, a pickaxe and a shovel discarded beside it as if in haste. They weren't the first to arrive. 3 dark figures were scrambling near the cliff dwelling, their movements urgent, furtive, like vultures disturbed at a feast. Chapter 23. Looks like the welcoming committee beat us to the punch, Rip, Roy Stover breathed, his voice a low growl that barely disturbed the immense, watchful silence of the hidden canyon. Moonlight, cold and silver, spilled into the natural amphitheater, painting the ancient cliff dwelling, and the 3 dark figures scrambling near its base in stark relief. The glint of metal, a shovel, perhaps a rifle barrel, flashed erratically. The men moved with a furtive, greedy haste, like coyotes digging for a buried carcass. Rip Campbell nodded, his eyes, already accustomed to the nocturnal gloom, narrowed as he studied the scene. The disturbed earth and discarded tools near the base of the cliff dwelling confirmed their fears. Cal Blount's hidden cache had been found, and these night visitors were in the process of plundering it. Gardner's men were just claim jumpers who got lucky. "Don't much matter, does it?" Roy whispered back, easing his Winchester from its saddle scabbard. Buck and Roy's mount stood patiently in the deeper shadows of the narrow canyon mouth where they dismounted. Gold like this breeds its own kind of trouble. And those boys yonder look like they were born to it. One of the figures straightened, a canvas sack in his hand, and said something to his companions. Even from this distance, his silhouette seemed vaguely familiar to Rip, a certain thickness through the shoulders, a way of standing. Then he remembered one of the names from Gardner's letters, a man mentioned in connection with mountain ventures and difficult acquisitions, Silas Hatcher. If it was Hatcher, then these were indeed Gardner's wolves, part of the wider web, come to claim a prize their dead master could no longer reach. "That big one," Rip murmured. "I think he's Silas Hatcher." Name was in Gardner's letters. Dealt in more than just cattle, according to those pages. "Then they know what this is worth," Roy concluded grimly. "And they won't be keen on sharing." There was no time for elaborate plans. The element of surprise was their only true advantage. Rip drew his Colts, the familiar weight of them a grim comfort. "We take them hard and fast, Roy. No parley. They find us here, they'll shoot on sight. We owe it to Blunt and ourselves to see this through." "My thoughts exactly, partner," Roy agreed, levering a shell into the Winchester's chamber, the metallic snick loud in the stillness. They moved like shadows themselves, using the scattered boulders and patches of deep moonlight obscurity for cover, angling to cut off any escape route back down the narrow canyon. The air grew colder, the silence amplifying the frantic scraping sounds from the cliff dwelling. As they drew within 50 yards, one of Hatcher's men, a lanky individual with a nervous twitch, straightened up abruptly, his head turned as if sensing their approach. He let out a sharp hiss. "Silas, someone's here." In an instant, the furtive digging ceased. The 3 men whirled, weapons appearing in their hands as if by dark magic. Silas Hatcher, his broad face now visible in a patch of moonlight, confirmed Rip's suspicion. His eyes, hard and black as obsidian chips, fixed on the approaching figures. "Well, well," Hatcher's voice, a gravelly baritone, echoed off the canyon walls. "Looks like we got company. Didn't reckon on anyone else knowin' about Cal Blount's little nest egg. Especially not after Gardner took care of Blunt himself." He smirked, a cold, predatory expression. "You boys from Gardner, then?" Come to check on his investment? Gardner's dead, Hatcher, Rip called out, his voice ringing clear and steady, a challenge in the silvered air. And his kind of investment don't pay dividends in this territory anymore. Hatcher's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of surprise, then a dawning, dangerous understanding. Dead, you say? He exchanged a quick, venomous glance with his two companions. Then I suppose that makes this finders keepers. And you two look like you're about to be found out. His hand flashed towards his holstered pistol. But Rip and Roy were already moving, the first shots of the battle erupting before Hatcher's gun even cleared leather. Roy's Winchester roared, the bullet screaming off the rock face near Hatcher's head, forcing him to duck back towards the deeper shadows of the cliff dwelling. Rip's twin Colts answered, driving the other two men, who had started to spread out, scrambling for cover amongst the ancient sun-bleached rocks that littered the canyon floor. The hidden amphitheater, silent for centuries save for the whisper of wind and the cry of eagles, became a battleground. Gunfire exploded in a series of sharp, vicious cracks, the echoes bouncing between the towering stone walls like angry demons. Lead spanged off rock, kicking up showers of dust and stone splinters. The acrid smell of gunsmoke filled the air, sharp and biting. Hatcher and his men were seasoned fighters, ruthless and desperate. They used the natural defenses of the cliff dwelling and the surrounding boulders skillfully, laying down a withering fire. One of them, the lanky, nervous one, tried to make a break for the narrow canyon pass, hoping to outflank Rip and Roy or escape into the darkness. Roy, anticipating the move, sent a carefully aimed shot from his Winchester that caught the man in the leg, sending him tumbling with a shriek of pain into a dense thicket of chala. Rip, meanwhile, pressed his attack on Hatcher, who had taken refuge in the mouth of one of the shallow caves that formed part of the cliff-dwelling complex. The leaning L associate was a deadly shot, his bullets pinning Rip down behind a crumbling section of ancient masonry. "You won't get out of here alive, Campbell," Hatcher yelled, his voice distorted by the echoes. "This gold is ours now. Gardner owed us. Gardner owed this land a damn sight more than he ever paid." Rip retorted, shifting his position, firing a quick volley that forced Hatcher deeper into the cave. He could hear Roy's Winchester still barking, keeping the third man occupied. The fight raged under the cold, indifferent gaze of the moon. It was a primal struggle in an ancient place, justice sought not in a courtroom but at the muzzle of a gun, amidst sun-bleached rocks and the silent witness of forgotten peoples. Rip knew this had to be the end of Gardner's direct threat. These men, privy to some of his deepest secrets, especially the lure of this hidden gold, could not be allowed to escape to carry on his legacy of greed and violence. Using a lull in Hatcher's fire, Rip made a daring move, scrambling over a pile of fallen rocks to gain a higher vantage point, one that offered a flanking angle on the cave mouth. He saw Roy, well covered, methodically pinning down the remaining gunman, who was now trying to make a fortified stand behind a large boulder. From his new position, Rip could see into the shallow cave where Hatcher was holed up. The big man was reloading, his face a mask of frustrated fury. Rip took careful aim. "It's over, Hatcher." Hatcher looked up, startled, as Rip's Colt roared. The bullet struck the stone inches from Hatcher's head, but the ricochet, or perhaps a splinter of rock, caught him on the temple. He staggered, dropping his pistol, a stunned look on his face. Before he could recover, Rip was on him, vaulting into the cave mouth. A short, brutal struggle ensued, Rip's hard-won strength and cold fury overwhelming the dazed gunman. He brought his pistol barrel down hard, and Silas Hatcher slumped to the cave floor, unconscious but alive. A final, defiant shot rang out from the last of Gardner's men, followed by a sharp cry and then silence. Rip emerged from the cave, his gun still ready, to see Roy Stover standing over the still form of the third gunman. "That one won't be causing any more trouble," Roy said, his voice grim. He gestured with his rifle towards the man he'd shot in the leg, who was now trying to drag himself further into the chala, moaning in pain. "And that one ain't going far." With the last echo of gunfire fading into the ancient stones, Rip lowered his smoking Colt, his gaze sweeping over the still forms of their adversaries. Silence, vast and profound, reclaimed the hidden canyon. The fight for Cal Blount's gold, the final desperate stand of Gardner's gang, was over. Desert justice, swift and brutal, had been delivered. Roy limped towards him, favoring the leg where a bullet had apparently grazed him during the final exchange, but a grim smile touched his lips. "Well, partner," he rasped, nodding towards the disturbed earth beneath the cliff dwelling where Hatcher's men had been digging, their canvas sacks lying abandoned, a few gleaming nuggets spilled in the moonlight. "Looks like Cal Blount's secret is finally ours. Now, what in the damn blazes do we do with it?" Chapter 24. "Well, partner," Roy Stover rasped, gingerly probing the bloody tear in his shirt sleeve where a bullet had grazed his arm. "Looks like Cal Blount's secret is finally ours. Now, what in the damn blazes do we do with it?" He gestured with his chin towards the freshly disturbed earth beneath the ancient cliff dwelling, where Silas Hatcher's men had frantically begun their looting before Rip and he had intervened. Several heavy canvas sacks, some spilling a gleam of raw gold nuggets in the silvered moonlight, lay abandoned. Rip Campbell took a deep, steadying breath, the adrenaline from the fierce gun battle slowly ebbing, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the familiar, throbbing ache in his head. He reloaded his Colts with methodical precision, his gaze sweeping the silent, moon-drenched amphitheater. Hatcher was securely bound, his earlier bluster replaced by a sullen, malevolent silence as he glared at them from where Rip had deposited him against a rock. The other two interlopers lay still, their greed permanently extinguished in the dust of the ancient canyon. "First things first, Roy," Rip said, his voice low and tired. "Let's see to that arm. And these, gentlemen." He nodded towards Hatcher and the dead men. "Victory always has its price, and the bill's usually paid in blood and bruises." They spent the next hour in the grim accounting that follows such brutal confrontations. Roy's wound, thankfully, was a clean graze, painful but not debilitating. Rip, still nursing the effects of Duffy's earlier blow and the accumulated strains of their relentless pursuit of justice, felt as though he'd been trampled by a herd of spooked longhorns. They buried Hatcher's two companions in shallow graves scraped from the rocky soil, a grim, silent task performed under the cold gaze of the desert moon. Silas Hatcher himself, still bound and defiant, merely watched, his eyes promising a vengeance he was unlikely ever to deliver. With the immediate dead tended to, they turned their attention to the gold. It wasn't a king's ransom, perhaps, but it was a significant hoard, sacks heavy with nuggets, and in the small cave Hatcher had briefly occupied, several more ingots of crudely smelted gold, clearly the fruits of Cal Blount's solitary labors. "He found a rich vein, no doubt about it," Roy murmured, hefting one of the sacks. "Enough here to make a man forget his conscience, or kill for it like Gardner did." He looked at Rip, his expression serious. "So, what is the just way to handle this, partner? Blount's dead. Gardner, who murdered him for it, is dead. Hatcher here and his wolves tried to steal it from a dead man's dream. Does it belong to us by right of, well, by right of gunsmoke and grit?" Rip leaned against a cool slab of rock, the weight of their recent deeds settling upon him. The West had its own harsh codes, and finders keepers was often the only law that applied in these remote, ungoverned canyons. But the specters of Cal Blount, Jim Simpson, and the near lynching of Roy himself, all victims of the greed this gold had ignited, gave him pause. "This gold is soaked in blood, Roy," he said finally. "Blount's, and now these men's. Keeping it outright, it doesn't sit right. Not all of it, anyway." He thought for a moment. "Blount might have kin somewhere. If they can be found, they've got the first claim. What can't be claimed by blood should maybe go towards undoing some of the harm Gardner did. Simpson's 8x8 will need rebuilding, not just in stock but in spirit. San Carlos itself has a reckoning to face with its own conscience. A tall order to fill with a few sacks of rocks, even gold ones, Roy observed, though there was understanding in his tone. But I see your point. This ain't just treasure, it's evidence. The price of truth, you might call it. Something like that, Rip agreed. We'll take it back to San Carlos. With Hatcher here as living proof of Gardner's wider dealings, and with what Duffy can testify about Chavez's confession, maybe some formal justice can finally take root. The gold can be part of that, held until rightful ownership is sorted, or used to help the territory heal. The journey back to San Carlos was slow and arduous, a stark contrast to their urgent ride into the Dragoons. They traveled with Hatcher as their unwilling prisoner, his hands bound, his mood venomous, and the weight of the gold surprisingly burdensome on a pack mule they pressed into service. Rip and Roy were weary, their wounds a constant reminder of the violence they had endured and inflicted. The silence of the trail was often broken only by Hatcher's occasional curses or Roy's attempts at a cheerful song, quickly stifled by Rip's somber mood. When they finally rode into San Carlos, leading their prisoner and the gold-laden mule, the town greeted them not with the fury of a lynch mob, but with a strange, subdued curiosity. News of Gardner's death and the battle at Bitter Creek had spread, but the full truth of the gold and Gardner's deeper villainy was yet unknown. They found the town slowly beginning to grapple with the consequences of its recent madness. Tom Duffy, his leg crudely set and his face etched with a mixture of pain and shame, was confined to his own jail, not as a prisoner awaiting lynching, but as a disgraced lawman awaiting the arrival of a circuit judge. He had made a full, formal deposition of Chavez's confession and his own role in Gardner's schemes, his words reportedly shocking the town's more sober citizens into a grim understanding of how thoroughly they had been deceived. His final stand at the jail, though born of desperation, had indeed become a turning point, and he now seemed resigned to facing the legal consequences of his earlier blindness and corruption. Rip and Roy turned Hatcher and the gold over to a hastily formed citizens' committee, led by the blacksmith and the storekeeper, men who had tasted the bitter fruit of mob rule and now seemed determined to see true justice done. Hatcher's presence and the tale of his connection to Gardner and his attempt to steal Blount's gold added another damning chapter to the saga of the Leaning L's treachery. Word also came from the 8x8. With Gardner's threat removed, and with the news of Jim Simpson's brave stand spreading, former hands were returning, and neighboring ranchers were offering help. A distant nephew of Simpson's had reportedly been located and was on his way to take charge. The ranch, shattered by violence and loss, was showing the first green shoots of recovery, a testament to its late owner's resilient spirit. As evening approached, Rip and Roy stood on the veranda of the San Carlos Hotel, watching the last rays of the sun paint the desert sky in hues of orange and purple. The town was quieter now, the raw wounds of Gardner's reign beginning to scar over, the fever of the mob broken. Justice, in its slow, imperfect way, was being weighed. Duffy would face his trial, his future uncertain, but his path towards a painful redemption begun. The gold, the catalyst for so much bloodshed, was secure, its fate to be decided by calmer heads and clearer laws. The price of truth had been high, lives lost, trust shattered, a community brought to the brink, but it had at last been paid. Roy stretched, wincing slightly as he favored his healing arm. "Well, partner," he said, his voice thoughtful, "this town's had about all the excitement it can handle from the likes of us for a good, long while, I reckon. And I, for one, have had my fill of jail cells and lynch mobs." He looked out at the vast, darkening expanse of the desert. "What say we find a trail that ain't quite so crowded with other folks' troubles?" Chapter 25. Sounds like the wisest thing I've heard all month, partner, Rip replied, a rare, tired smile touching his lips as he looked at Roy Stover. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of San Carlos, painting the newly repaired jailhouse and the slowly reawakening storefronts in hues of gold and deepening purple. This Arizona dust has about settled for us, I reckon. And my bones are weary of other folks' gunsmoke. Roy grinned, the expression easing some of the lingering hardness from his face, a face that had seen too much of the inside of a cell and the shadow of a noose. Mine too, Rip. Mine too. A man could get used to sleeping under open stars again without listening for the rattle of keys or the howl of a lynch mob. They stood on the veranda of the San Carlos Hotel, two figures lean and weathered, marked by the recent crucible of violence and betrayal. Behind them, the town was slowly, painfully, finding its way back to a semblance of peace. The reign of Brock Gardner was a fresh, ugly scar, but the poison was being purged. Silas Hatcher, Gardner's man from the Dragoons, was securely locked in the jail he'd never expected to see from the inside, awaiting the circuit judge who was also tasked with deciding Tom Duffy's fate. The ex-sheriff, his leg mending, his spirit humbled, had cooperated fully, his testimony and Chavez's relayed confession providing the territorial authorities with a damning indictment of Gardner's far-reaching criminal enterprises. Cal Blount's gold, recovered from the hidden cache, was now under lock and key, its rightful disposition a matter for lawyers and whatever kin of Blount's might be found. The Leaning L Ranch was in the hands of a receiver appointed by the territorial marshal, its vast herds being meticulously tallied, its legitimate holdings separated from Gardner's ill-gotten gains. Jim Simpson's 8x8, under the stewardship of his newly arrived nephew, a young man with Simpson's quiet resolve in his eyes, was already beginning to rebuild, a symbol of resilience in a land that had seen too much greed. The courage of men like Simpson, and the hard-won truth that Rip and Roy had dragged into the light, had indeed watered the parched soil of justice in this corner of Arizona. So, Roy said, breaking the comfortable silence, which way does that less crowded trail lie, you figure? North, to the high country. West, towards the California haze. Or south, where the mesquite blooms and a man can lose himself between one horizon and the next. Rip gazed out at the vast, beckoning expanse of the desert, now bathed in the soft, ethereal light of twilight. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. A profound sense of peace, hard-earned and fragile, settled over him. The trail chooses the rider as much as the rider chooses the trail, Roy, he said quietly. But I reckon any direction where a man can earn an honest day's pay without having to look over his shoulder every 5 minutes would suit me fine right now. They spent one more day in San Carlos, settling their accounts, ensuring their horses were perfectly shod, their gear meticulously checked and replenished. There were quiet nods of respect from townsfolk who, just days before, had been baying for Roy's blood. There were offers of work, of land, of a place to settle. But the call of the open range, the lure of distant, unknown horizons, was too strong in their blood. They were men of the trail, their partnership forged not in the confines of settlement, but in the wide, wild spaces where danger and adventure walked hand in hand. On the morning of their departure, the desert sunrise painted the eastern sky in breathtaking strokes of crimson, orange, and pale primrose. The air was fresh, alive with the promise of a new day. They rode out of San Carlos with no fanfare, just two figures heading west, towards the broken ramparts of the distant mountains. Buck, Rip's big bay, moved with his familiar ground-eating stride, while Roy's newly acquired sorrel, a spirited animal with fire in its eyes, matched him pace for pace. They paused on the last rise overlooking the town, now awakening to its daily business, the sounds of life, a blacksmith's hammer, a child's laughter, the creak of a wagon, drifting up to them on the morning breeze. San Carlos, for all its recent turmoil, was alive, and on a path, however rocky, towards healing. "She's a tough old bird, this territory," Roy observed, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "Takes a lot to kill her spirit." "Like some folks we know," Rip commented, a rare twinkle in his eye. Roy grinned. "Present company included, I hope." He looked at Rip, his expression sobering. "We came through it, Rip. Gardner, the frame-up, the lynch mob, Hatcher and his gold-hungry wolves. We faced it all down." "We did, partner," Rip affirmed. Their shared ordeal had been a trial by fire, stripping away everything but the essential core of their loyalty to each other, their innate sense of justice. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable, their understanding of each other needing no words. Rip gathered his reins. "The trail ahead won't be easy. It never is. There'll be other Gardners, other injustices. But as long as men of goodwill are willing to make a stand, then there's always hope," Roy finished for him. He settled his hat firmly on his head. "Well, I've had enough philosophizing to last me a month of Sundays. That horizon ain't getting any closer by us just looking at it." With a final, lingering look at the Arizona land that had tested them so severely, a land now slowly being cleansed by courage and watered with truth, Rip Campbell and Roy Stover turned their horses west. They rode not towards a specific destination, but towards the promise of new beginnings, towards distant horizons where adventure and justice still called. Their trail had ended in San Carlos, but 1,000 new trails lay before them, stretching out into the vast unfathomed heart of the West. The sun climbed higher, warm on their backs, and the only sounds were the rhythmic creak of saddle leather, the steady beat of their horses' hooves, and the low, contented whistle that Roy Stover had just begun to shape on his lips. The desert stretched endlessly away, beautiful and terrible in its vast indifference. The end. Want even more Wild West adventure? Let me send you Wrangler for free. And don't miss Pecan Creek War, Scatter Shot, $10 Mustang, Pistol Whipped, Red River Ferry, Last Drop, Cowpuncher, Bearcat Pass, Fast Shot, As Good as Gold, Ramble Range, Claim Jumper, Gunpowder Trouble, Bushwhack Range, Bear Wash War, Kicking Dust, Outlaw Range, Six Gun Preacher, Outlaw Trail, Gunpowder Range, Wild Ride, Southbound, Crack Shot, Bloodied Trail, False Star, Cimarron Breaks, Ghost Town, Cayuse Crossing, Night Canyons, Vengeance Trail, Blood and Dust, Last Draw, $10 Cowboy, Outlaw Train,